Chapter 3607. When Yuan raised his eyes and looked at him in shock, Yi Mulan smiled faintly and walked over to put his arm around her shoulders. Are you stupid? He took the 2 million yuan from her hand and smiled. Just treat it as your future sister-in-law buying candy for Xiangnan. Oh right. He looked up at Yi Mubai. Mubai, you haven't seen your nephew yet, right? Yi Xiangnan, come here. At this moment, a small person ran over and hugged Yi Mulan's leg, calling him daddy. Yi Mulan carried Yi Xiangnan and hugged Wen Yuan with one hand. He looked at Yi Mubai and said, my son looks like me, right? Yi Mubai still frowned and cursed. Fuck. He wasn't such a rude man in the past. But now he had evolved into a monkey who hadn't fully evolved yet. He was rude and arrogant. When Yuan was stunned, his body stiffened as he looked at Yi Mulan. He just smiled. We're family. Then he looked at Lin Xuei. I'm Mubai's brother Yi Mulan. Mubai might have forgotten about us, but we welcome him home anytime. Also, if Miss Lin is interested, you can come to our house as a guest. But if you speak rudely to my wife again, I won't welcome you. Actually, Lin Xuei didn't want such a powerful person to appear. But Yi Mulan's identity wasn't something a small musician like her could shake. Besides, she was also tempted. With such an identity in Mubai's, marrying into the Yi family would be a great help to her career. So she started to lick him, and it was especially ugly. Yi Mubai looked at Lin Xuei in surprise and said lightly, are you going to celebrate alone? Lin Xuei couldn't let go of such an opportunity, so she hugged his arm and said considerately, Mubai, I want to accompany you. Yi Mubai patted her hand. I have something to do, be good. Although he was very gentle, he couldn't be rejected. Lin Xuei was unhappy, but she could only hold it in and smile. Okay, I'll find you later. Yi Mubai's gaze had already landed on Yi Mulan and Yi Xiangnan in his arms, followed by Wen Yuan. His gaze lingered on Wen Yuan's face for about 3 seconds before he said calmly, brother, tell me about the past tonight. He lit a cigarette. In the past few years, I've forgotten a lot of things, but not completely. At least when Yi Mulan said it was his brother, he believed it because of his intuition. Yi Mulan smiled and carried Xiangnan out. When Yuan looked at Yi Mubai, Yi Mubai took 2 steps forward and forced her to the corner of the wall. He lowered his head and whispered in her ear, we've slept together, haven't we, sister-in-law? When Yuan widened his eyes and stared at him. Yi Mubai, he sneered. Your eyes are filled with restlessness and desire to become one with me. What, my big brother can't satisfy you? He reached out and gently stroked her face. Don't think about me, woman. She turned her face away awkwardly. I didn't. Do you? He said, already reaching for her hand. She was wearing a gown, so there was only a thin piece of cloth inside. It couldn't hide anything at all. He could easily feel all of her. Chapter 3608. As he said that, he let go of her abruptly, his attitude extremely nasty. When Yuan took a few steps back and looked at him in shock, Yi Mubai looked at her and smiled. Don't look at me like that. You're making me want to commit a crime, he murmured. Got it, sister-in-law? He was so mean. When Yuan bit her lip and walked in front, she said in a low voice, you're thinking too much. Really? Yi Mubai chuckled softly and followed behind her. Yi Mulan had already gotten into the car. Given his status, he was naturally seated in the back seat. When Yuan went over and Xiangnan called out Mom before she followed. By the time Yi Mubai came over, it was too cramped with 4 people in the back seat. Hence, he could only sit in the front seat. Actually, it wasn't a big deal. There was nothing good about squeezing together, especially since they were a family of 3. Yi Mubai sat there with his long limbs. As he listened to Yi Mulan say that they were going back to the villa, the chauffeur started the car. Yi Mulan had already called Yi Zhenggang and Su Fu earlier on. As it was really too late, he arranged to meet them the next day, and they would stay at his villa for the night. After driving for about half an hour, they turned into a secluded private passage. Yi Mulan's villa was right in front of them. The car stopped, and Yi Mulan carried Xiangnan out of the car. She then held the car door with one hand to let Wen Yuan get off, looking very affectionate. Wen Yuan was also stunned. Yi Mulan was not like this in the past, but she was always smart. She then smiled faintly and reached out to hold his arm, gently leaning against his side. Yi Mubai got out of the car and happened to see this scene. His gaze landed on Wen Yuan. She looked rather docile and had decent looks. Her figure was alright. Overall, she looked alright. She was the harmless type. At this moment, she was leaning against the man's side, looking very blissful. Yi Mubai thought coldly. With a husband like Yi Mulin, what else could she be dissatisfied with? Did she still want to fool around outside? Just because you have a pure and innocent face? He walked over, and Xiangnan called him uncle. Only then did he take a closer look at the child. He looked very similar to his older brother, and he looked very obedient. Yi Mubai smiled and hugged Xiangnan. Xiangnan immediately hugged his neck. The child's body was warm and furry. Yi Mubai's cold heart warmed up. He kissed Yi Xiangnan. However, the moment he looked up, he saw Yi Mulin taking off his jacket and draping it over Wen Yuan's shoulders. He held her with one arm and walked forward. Wen Yuan wasn't short, but she seemed very petite in Yi Mulin's arms. As they walked in front, Yi Mulin's eyes burned with passion as he looked at Yi Mulin, who was behind them. He blamed this woman's restlessness, not their love. When they arrived at the villa, Yi Mulin asked Wen Yuan to coax Xiangnan to sleep and let her change her clothes. When he said these words, his voice was very gentle. It was completely the tone of a husband talking to his wife. It made Wen Yuan not too used to it. However, she didn't refute him and was very docile. She carried the child upstairs. After coaxing him, she changed into a set of home clothes and went downstairs. She personally brewed coffee for them. After Yi Mubai took it, he looked at her again. His gaze was a little cold. Chapter 3609. As for Wen Yuan, Yi Mulin did not mention a single word about him. There were some things that could not be reversed now, such as Mubai having Lin Shui by his side. If he wanted to take it back, he could only do the opposite. He thought that with Wen Yuan's intelligence, he should be able to understand his intentions. Wen Yuan could indeed do it. She stayed in Yi Mulin's embrace obediently and listened to their conversation attentively. Occasionally, she would hold Yi Mulin's hand and watch him talk. Yi Mubai did not understand this woman. They were clearly in love with each other. Why did she say those words to him before? Or did he remember wrongly? This woman seemed to love his elder brother very much. His elder brother should not have any problems in that aspect. Could it be that she was not satisfied and wanted to develop her relationship with him? Just like that, they chatted all night until 1 in the morning. When the topic ended, Wen Yuan had already fallen asleep in Yi Mulin's embrace. Yi Mulin lowered his head and patted her face. Wen Yuan. She opened her eyes in a daze. Mulin, are you guys done? He then said to Yi Mubai. I'll carry her upstairs first, then I'll come down and talk to you. Yi Mubai stared at the woman and let Yi Mulin carry her gently. Yi Mulin was simply an actor. He smiled and said, Wen Yuan, you're too heavy. If this goes on, I won't be able to carry you anymore. Wen Yuan nestled in his arms and said in a low voice, Yi Mulin, aren't you acting a little too much? He smiled and looked at her. You don't like it? If you don't like it, I'll tell him right now that we're faking our marriage. You can pursue him right now. No. Wen Yuan did not even think about it. He's not the Mubai from before. Yi Mulin smiled and reached out to brush the hair off her forehead. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared into the corridor. Yi Mubai watched the process of the couple's love, and his hand that was holding the coffee cup tightened. He was even thinking that when they got upstairs, they would fall on the bed and kiss. Then his brother would go downstairs after he was satisfied. After all, Wen Yuan looked quite delicious. He suddenly felt a little uncomfortable. What was this? She had teased him and said those words, and now, she was showing off her love in front of him. He felt that he had been fooled by this woman. Yi Mubai wanted to take a big sip of coffee to calm himself down, but found that the cup was almost empty, so he had to put it down. After sitting on the sofa and waiting for a while, Yi Mubai finally came downstairs. It should have been a full 5 minutes. Yi Mubai's mind couldn't help but start racing again. Yi Mulin went downstairs and paused for a moment on the stairs. He looked at his brother, then went down and smiled. Xiangnan woke up. He insisted that I tell him a story before he went to sleep. Yi Mubai froze for a moment and coughed lightly. I thought. Why? Yi Mulan seemed to be in good spirits, and he was very talkative. Then he said something that was common among men. Do you think I only have 5 minutes? Yi Mubai's mind was racing again. He couldn't describe the feeling in his heart. He tried to convince himself that he and his wife already had a child. How could they not have slept together? What does that have to do with you? Thinking of this, he felt a little better. Then, he chatted with Yi Mulan about the past. Yi Mulan talked most of the time, and he listened. Of course, Yi Mulan deliberately avoided talking about Bai Shueli and Wen Yuan's past. But after he finished talking, Yi Mubai said, I forgot a lot of things, but some people still remember. I saw Bai Shueli overseas. She was with a rather famous photographer, and they even had a child. Do you still remember that she had a crush on me and cried that she wanted to marry me? Yi Mulan was stunned. Chapter 36:10. He held the coffee cup and pretended to be nonchalant. How old is the child? Yi Mubai frowned. About 2 or 3 years old, about the same age as Xiangnan. Yi Mubai clenched his fists tightly. After a while he smiled faintly. Not bad. Not bad. His heart was in turmoil, but he didn't show it on his face. Then he chatted with Yi Mubai for a while. He told him what he wanted him to know, but didn't mention anything that he didn't want him to know. In the end, he arranged for Yi Mubai to sleep in the guest room. When he was about to leave, Yi Mubai was a little confused. You're not going to sleep here? Sleep here? Yi Mulan smiled gently. Mubai, I'm a married man. If I don't sleep with my wife, I'll be laughed at if I sleep with my brother. As he said this, he patted Yi Mubai's shoulder and smiled. Wen Yuan is waiting for me. I'll go upstairs first. Yi Mubai watched him walk out. His steps were a little fast, as if he couldn't wait to go back to his room. Was he in a hurry to go back and have sex with Wen Yuan? Yi Mubai's mind went crazy again. He looked in the room, but didn't find any wine. He usually drank a glass of wine before going to bed, so he went out to find a bottle in the living room and bring it back to his room. The living room was a little dark. He turned on the light, but he was stunned when he turned it on. There was a couple hugging each other on the sofa. They should be kissing. Yi Mulan was sitting, and Wen Yuan was sitting on his lap. She was wearing a champagne-colored silk nightgown with the shoulder strap slid down. Her hair was put in front, revealing half of her beautiful white back. The cream color was very thin and smooth. Moreover, the nightgown was very short. It only covered the t-shirt. Her legs were very attractive. Yi Mubai looked at it and shamefully found that he had a reaction. He had a physiological reaction to his sister-in-law. He coughed uncomfortably. I want to drink some red wine. Oh, Yi Mulan said, and let go of Wen Yuan. He patted her and said in a low voice, Go upstairs and wait for me. He even took the coat and put it on her shoulders. His eyes were gentle and a little lustful. I want to applaud Bossia's acting skills. He really tried his best. Wen Yuan bit his lips and walked upstairs barefooted. Yi Mubai felt that he shouldn't be looking, but he still followed her figure and looked at her legs and back. Based on a man's intuition, her body was very soft and suitable for hugging. I'll get some red wine for you. Yi Mulan smiled faintly and walked to the wine cabinet to pick 2 bottles. Which year do you like? Yi Mubai walked over and picked one up. I'll take this. When he took it, Yi Mulan didn't let go. He looked at Yi Mubai and said in a low voice, Mubai, Wen Yuan is your sister-in-law. I love her very much. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yi Mubai was stunned for a moment, and then looked at his big brother. At this moment, Yi Mulan let go and the red wine in Yi Mubai's hand almost fell to the ground. Then he smiled. Big brother, don't worry. I'm not interested in other people's wives. Moreover, she's your wife. That's good. Yi Mulan smiled like a spring breeze. Bring Lin Shui back tomorrow for mom and dad to see. It's good to settle down early. You're already in your 30s. As soon as he finished speaking, he went upstairs. His footsteps were even more urgent than before. Yi Mubai stood downstairs and watched him go up. Then he heard the sound of the door closing. After that, there was a soft sound. He did not know if it was just his imagination, but he felt like he heard a man's rough breathing and a woman's soft screams. Chapter 36:11. Thinking of that woman's body, Yi Mubai's eyes became cold. A woman who only knew how to use her beauty to please others. When did his brother's taste become so bad? He took the wine back to the room, stood up and poured himself a glass. He drank it in one gulp, and poured himself another glass, before he could even taste the extreme sourness. After drinking, she became more and more clear-headed. Lying on the bed, she recalled the scene of that beautiful body sitting on Yi Mulan's lap. As a woman who had given birth to a child, her figure was well-maintained and very fair. Yi Mubai couldn't help but swallow. His body, which had not been a woman for a long time, couldn't help but tense up. Damn it. He refused to think about that body again, and convinced himself to fall asleep as soon as possible. But it still didn't work. He couldn't fall asleep at all, so he got up and drank up the bottle of red wine. He felt that it was not enough, so he didn't turn on the light, and went to the living room outside to get another bottle of red wine. But the light in the living room was on, and there was someone there. In the middle of the night, his dear sister-in-law was wearing a thin suspender nightgown, not the previous one, but a thinner and more transparent one. She was half squatting in front of the cabinet, and seemed to be choosing red wine. And from Yi Mubai's direction, he could see nothing under the suspender. The light shone on her back, and he could almost see her whole body. He suddenly felt a little dry and impatient, but he didn't make a sound, and just stood in the dark. She seemed to have picked what she wanted. She straightened up and was ready to leave, but when she looked up, she saw Yi Mubai. Wen Yuan looked surprised and didn't move at all. Then he suddenly reached out and hugged himself. She bit her lip, took a step back, and then fell on the sofa. Yi Mubai walked over lightly and stood in front of her, even standing in the middle of her body rudely. He looked down at her for a while, then bent over and leaned over her. Wen Yuan closed his eyes and turned his face to the side. No. Yi Mubai picked up the red wine she dropped with one hand. His body was leaning over her, and his face was so close to hers that he could see her pores clearly. Her skin was very fine, very clear, with a touch of redness. He didn't know if it was because of the sex. Thinking of this, his thin lips slightly curved up. He looked at her trembling eyelashes and murmured, "Are you afraid of me? Or are you looking forward to me kissing you?" "I didn't." She slowly opened her eyes. Her breasts rose and fell, which was very alluring. Yi Mubai was also a normal man. He admitted that he had been seduced by her. His fingers gently stroked her face, and his voice was hoarse. "You clearly know that I live here, so why did you deliberately dress like this? Who do you think you are? And who do you think I am, huh?" His fingers gently pinched her chin, and then moved down gently. Her breathing became a little chaotic. She bit her lips and looked straight at him. Against the light, his face looked particularly deep and pitiless, as if he would have torn the flimsy garment she wore to pieces if he so chose. Wen Yuan finally said, "Get up." Chapter 36:12. His fingers caressed her arm. "You seem to be trembling. It's right to be afraid. Stay away from me." With that said, he got up and stuffed the wine into her hands. It almost broke. "Don't dress like this to provoke men in the future. Men are not as easy to provoke as you think." With that said, he picked a bottle of wine and left without looking back. Wen Yuan was still lying on the sofa with her eyes half closed. Her heart was still heaving up and down. She recalled just now. He was clearly excited. Could he be excited in front of sister-in-law? He always said that she was seducing him. But in fact, he was the one who was excited and wanted to do it immediately. Of course, it was true that she was seducing him. Wen Yuan stood up and took the red wine upstairs. When she went upstairs, she saw Yi Mulan leaning against the corridor. He had a faint smile on his face. "You don't look too good." With that said, he took a thick robe for her to wear. Wen Yuan quietly fastened it, and followed him upstairs to the study. Yi Mulan sat behind the desk out of habit. "Wen Yuan, I have something to talk to you about." Wen Yuan nodded and sat on the sofa. "Me too." They looked at each other, and she let him speak first. Yi Mulan thought for a moment, and took out a document. "Wen Yuan, I heard from Mubai that he saw Shirley. Now that Mubai is back, let's divorce first so that we can pursue our own happiness without being restrained by the law." Wen Yuan had no objections at all. She flipped open the document and wanted to sign it. But before she signed, she saw the words on it and was stunned. Mulan. He actually gave her 50 million. Yi Mulan smiled. I've arranged for Xiangnan to study in America and New York. You can go there to accompany him. Also, I'll get Mubai to take care of him. He looked at her. Remember, don't tell him that we're divorced. Otherwise he won't let you near him. When Yuan looked a little dazed, Yi Mulan chuckled. Make him unable to stand the fact that he slept with you. Make him take responsibility. Make him come to me for a divorce. When Yuan felt that they had been faking their marriage for quite some time, but she did not seem to understand him very well. How did he manage to become that person with such a view of the world? She had seen the news about him, and he was outstanding when he walked out. Even when she was living with him, she felt that Yi Mulan was quite noble. But now, it was a little hard to explain. When Yuan did not reject his good intentions, because Yi Mulan said, When Yuan, Xiangnan is my nephew, so you're my sister-in-law. Even if you're not, you're still my younger sister. It's easy to take care of the two of you. In the future, don't play for others. You play better than her. When Yuan was touched for a moment, she had never thought that Yi Mulan would think this way. He had always been indifferent. Now that she thought about it, he had indeed taken care of her a lot. He had always given her face when it came to Xiangnan and the Wen family. This time, when he said that he would not announce the divorce, it was probably to protect her. When Yuan looked at him, and Yi Mulan laughed. I didn't do it for you. I did it for myself. When Yuan's expression, he continued. I've prepared an apartment for you in New York. It's not big, just 2 bedrooms and a living room. However, the location is really good. It's safe and suitable for Xiangnan to grow up. I'll visit you guys when I'm free. Chapter 36:13. Yi Mulan smiled. What are you thanking me for? Xiangnan is Mubai's child. I can't let him call me dad for the rest of his life. Besides, I still have to chase after my wife. It's tough just thinking about it. When Yuan looked at him, are you going to look for her? Yi Mulan smoked a cigarette and smiled. It's up to her. I'll wait for her to come back. With his current identity, he couldn't go around looking for a woman. Besides, he had to call Wen Yuan his wife. He couldn't live without a wife. He felt sad when he thought about it. At the same time, he was a little angry with her. So, he was waiting for her to come back and beg him. Wen Yuan roughly knew what he was thinking. He smiled and said, Can you wait? She paused and said something that hurt his heart. Mulan, you should be 40 this year. Yi Mulan snorted. So what if I'm 40? Bai Shueli is already in her early 30s. Wen Yuan sighed. So don't let her wait too long. Yi Mulan rolled his eyes. She's the one who made me wait too long. Wen Yuan smiled and signed the document. Yi Mulan kept it, and planned to let Secretary Li handle it the next day. After putting away the documents, he looked at her. Go to sleep. I'll sleep here. Wen Yuan nodded and walked out. Yi Mulan was alone in the study. He didn't go to sleep immediately. Instead, he took out his phone and opened the photo album. He found Bai Shueli's photo. He was thinking about Mubai's words. A child 2 or 3 years old. He was sure that it was his child. It had been a few months since her father came out. He stood so tall and conspicuous. Why didn't she come back? Why didn't she want to go back to him? Yi Mulan looked down and revealed a bitter smile. He woke up early in the morning and tidied up the study on the 2nd floor. He went to the master bedroom to change his clothes and kiss Xiangnan. Uncle is going to work. Xiangnan was still under the blanket. He stretched out his thin arms and hugged him. Goodbye, Uncle. Yi Mulan smiled and kissed him again. Then he walked out. When he got downstairs, he saw that Yi Mubai was already there. He smiled. Did you sleep well last night? Yi Mubai leaned back in his chair and casually flipped through the newspaper. It's pretty good. He looked up and smiled. Sister-in-law, where's Xiangnan? Yi Mulan answered him after he sat down. I slept late last night, and Wen Yuan hasn't woken up yet. Her class doesn't start until 10 p.m., so I slept a little longer. Xiangnan was happy too. Yi Mubai asked casually. Xiangnan slept with you? Yes, Yi Mulan replied casually. Yi Mubai was silent for a while before he said, Won't this affect your married life? Yi Mulan almost spat out the milk he was drinking. He looked at Yi Mubai with a complicated expression. After a long time he slowly said, "We will all wait for Xiangnan to fall asleep." After that, he didn't want to say anything more. The atmosphere was a little strange. Fortunately, Yi Milan didn't seem to mind. He quickly finished his breakfast and went to do his business. They had arranged to have a family reunion at 6 o'clock that night. Yi Mubai watched him leave in his car. He retracted his gaze and looked at the morning newspaper. It was a report on Lin Shui's concert last night. But the photo on the front page was a picture of Yi Mulan and Wen Yuan walking out together. Yi Mulan's hand was on Wen Yuan's waist. They looked very compatible. Chapter 36:14. She wore a very simple dress today, and her long hair was simply braided. She looked very gentle, completely different from the sexy girl last night. He stared at her, watching her carry Xiangnan, and let the little boy sit down. She even smiled at him. Then, she began to teach Xiangnan how to eat by himself. Xiangnan was very obedient, and his temperament seemed to be similar to Wen Yuan's, at least on the surface. He felt that the Wen Yuan from last night was the real Wen Yuan. She was a woman who needed a man very much. As he thought of this, there was a little disdain in his eyes. Of course, Wen Yuan didn't notice it. She only cared about her son, talking to Xiangnan softly, and taking care of his food until the end of breakfast. Finally she said softly, "Xiangnan, Mom has to go to work. You have to be good at home." Xiangnan made an "oh" sound, then looked at Yi Mubai. "Can I be with Uncle?" Wen Yuan was a little embarrassed. She reached out and touched his little head, whispering, "Xiangnan, Uncle has something to do." Xiangnan was a little disappointed, but Yi Mubai said indifferently, "I'll take care of him. I have nothing to do these 2 days anyway." Wen Yuan thought for a moment, but still refused. "You should accompany Miss Lin." Yi Mubai looked at her, and there was some mockery in his eyes. "That's what you mean. Last night I misjudged you. I saw you as my husband." Wen Yuan said quickly and anxiously. Then she lowered her head. "It's all a misunderstanding. Don't mention it again in the future. Also, my relationship with Mulan is very good. I don't want to be affected." Yi Mubai stared at her and lowered her voice. "Do you dare to say that you love him? If you love him, you still dare to flirt with others?" Wen Yuan bit her lips. "I love him." Then she looked at him a little hurriedly. "I have to go to work. There are servants at home. If you want to go out, leave Xiangnan to them." After saying that, she went upstairs to take her bag, and then drove away. Yi Mubai kept looking at her. Xiangnan came over and hugged his leg. "Uncle, do you like Mommy?" Yi Mubai lowered his head and pinched the little thing's little face. "Nonsense. Uncle has a girlfriend. Your mother and father like each other." Xiangnan thought about it and said seriously, "Does Uncle like Auntie Lin? I don't think she looks as good as Mom." Then Xiangnan complained, "Xiong is so small." Yi Mubai was stunned for a moment. In fact, he had never cared whether Lin Shui's breasts were big or not, nor did he measure them. But how did Xiangnan know this at such a young age? He stared at Xiangnan. Xiangnan stuck out his tongue. It was on TV. He said that all men liked Xiong. In Yi Mubai's mind, the scene of him pressing her on the sofa last night suddenly appeared. At that time he pressed against her. Apart from anything else, it was really big. Because of that thought, he couldn't help licking his lips. "Yi Xiangnan, don't say that in the future." Xiangnan looked at him blankly and replied with a no. Then he asked, "Uncle, does your name mean the night will turn white tonight?" Yi Mubai smiled. "What about you, Xiangnan?" Yi Xiangnan tilted his little head. "Mom said that the place she longs for the most is Yunnan, so I'm called Yi Xiangnan." Yunnan. Yi Mubai's mind buzzed for a moment, and he couldn't describe the feeling. After a while he coughed lightly. "Is that where your parents went on their honeymoon? It's really unique." Xiangnan glanced at him and said faintly, "It's a place where my mother accidentally lost a man she liked in the past." Yi Mubai was surprised. Wasn't Wen Yuan too straightforward? He actually used his son's name to express his yearning for another man? Didn't his brother mind? Xiangnan smiled. "Dad doesn't mind. He said that he's the one with Mom now. He doesn't care about anything else." Yi Mubai just smiled. His impression of Wen Yuan was a little worse. It turned out that she wasn't just infatuated with him, but with many other people. He felt extremely uncomfortable. He told himself that it was because he despised this woman, and there was absolutely no other reason. But he vaguely knew that it wasn't as simple as despising her. Chapter 36:15. Yi Mubai stayed with Yi Xiangnan in the villa for a whole day, and didn't go anywhere. Of course, Lin Shui had called to hint to him that she wanted to come over. With Yi Mubai's family background, of course, she would try her best to curry favor with him, but Yi Mubai refused indifferently. Putting away the phone, he looked at Xiangnan. Xiangnan's face was full of maturity that he shouldn't have at his age. He laughed dryly and said, "Haha, uncle, I told you that you don't like Auntie Lin that much." Yi Mubai squatted down and looked at Xiangnan. "What kind of woman do you think is suitable for uncle?" Xiangnan thought carefully and said, "I think mom is good." Yi Mubai also laughed dryly and said, "Your mom already has your dad." Xiangnan said stubbornly, "Anyway, mom is good." Yi Mubai thought that Wen Yuan was not a good woman, but the child loved her very much, and he also liked Xiangnan. He reached out and rubbed the little fellow's head. "Xiangnan, when you go to the United States in the future, I will take you there to play." Xiangnan looked at him blankly, then whispered, "Really? Mom told me that she might go to study for a year, and I will go with her. She asked me to study there for a year." Yi Mubai frowned. "Really?" Xiangnan nodded hard. His face became serious. He felt that Wen Yuan's decision was too selfish. How old was Xiangnan? He had to go to the United States with her. She only cared about herself. He felt that it was necessary to suggest to his brother that it was one thing to love his wife, but there should be a limit. Just like that, the day passed. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Hao Yin came over with Su Fu. As for Yi Mulin, Yi Mubai didn't feel anything after staying abroad for a long time. But Su Fu looked at him and felt sad and happy for a long time. Yi Zhengang was the same. It was probably because he was old and had been sad for a long time. However, men were always able to restrain themselves. 2 to 3 years had passed, and Yi Zhengang still did not treat Hao Yin well. He did not look for another woman and retired. He was not interested in women anymore, and only cared about gardening at home. Sometimes, Wen Yuan would send Xiangnan over to relieve his boredom. However, Yi Zhengang still missed Su Fu, who was still living in that old house. He was the only one living in the old house, and there were only servants. He was very lonely. Sometimes when he fell asleep he would dream. He always felt that this house was the same as before, with Su Fu, Mu Bai and Mu Lin, and even that girl by Xueli. Dreams. He was thinking, if he could do it all over again, would he be able to keep this house? He thought that he regretted it, he would. If he did not destroy the Bai family, that useless girl by Xueli would not have left. Mu Lin would not have distanced himself from him, and Su Fu would not have left him to follow that bastard Hao Yin. As he thought about it, he woke up alone. He really wanted to continue sleeping like this and never wake up. He could not figure out what was the point of living. Really, there was no point at all. At this moment, Yi Zhengang looked at his ex-wife being hugged by Hao Yin and comforted her softly. He hated it. He hated it. He wished he could replace Hao Yin to comfort Su Fu. Su Fu was obviously his. What right did that old thing Hao Yin have to touch him? Chapter 36:16. But now, he could only stare at her. He couldn't do anything. Moreover, he realized that Su Fu had become prettier. Although she took good care of herself when she was with him, she was still over 50 years old. But after she got together with Hao Yin, she seemed to have become younger. Her face was rosy and glowing, like a woman who was not even 40 years old. She was especially well-nourished. He stared at himself as he aged, while Su Fu became younger and younger. He stared at her like this, but she didn't know anything. She only had eyes for Hao Yin, just like how she only had eyes for him in the past. In the past, Hao Yin had nothing to do with her. Just as Yi Zhengang was feeling unhappy, Yi Mulin returned with Wen Yuan by his side. He and Wen Yuan walked side by side as they talked. The expression on his face was very gentle. Wen Yuan smiled and hugged his arm lightly, but he immediately put it down. Su Fu knew what was going on with Xiangnan, and also knew that Big Brother and Wen Yuan's marriage was fake. Now that she saw them putting in so much effort to put on an act, she didn't understand what was going on. But after she found out that Mu Bai had a girlfriend, she understood everything. Hence, Su Fu didn't say anything. Yi Mulan walked into the living room and patted Wen Yuan's hand. Go and have a chat with Mom. Wen Yuan nodded and helped him put away his coat. Then he went to talk to Su Fu. Yi Mubai had been staring at her since she came in. He looked like he was deep in thought. He really couldn't figure out this woman now. With his big brother's personality, he really felt that no woman would dare to have the heart and energy to develop their career after marrying him. His big brother was powerful, rich, and had a good body. He could satisfy any woman in all aspects. What kind of woman was Wen Yuan? What was certain was that he didn't like Wen Yuan very much. He only watched her in secret. However, Wen Yuan only chatted with Su Fu for a while before going to the kitchen. Although there were always servants cooking at home, as the hostess, she still had to take care of them. In addition, she would cook 1 or 2 dishes when necessary. Xiangnan liked her cooking, so Wen Yuan often cooked. Yi Mulan never objected to this. He was also considered an old-fashioned man, and his living habits were still stuck in the old mansion. He and Wen Yuan lived together, and in fact, they did not have many interactions or conflicts. Perhaps in some aspects, Wen Yuan was somewhat similar to Yi Mulan. After Wen Yuan left, Yi Mubai immediately withdrew his gaze. However, Yi Mulan continued to stare at him indifferently. Yi Mubai knew nothing about this. After a while, the tea was finished. There were no servants here to talk. Yi Mubai went to the kitchen to pour some water. He saw Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan was standing in front of the kitchen counter with 2 servants, watching her chop the vegetables. Wen Yuan was wearing an apron. Her long hair was tied up and placed in front of her chest, revealing a fair neck that was very delicate and beautiful. Yi Mubai walked over and stood beside her. You know how to cook? As he spoke, his hot breath landed on her soft neck. Wen Yuan shivered and looked at him sideways, looking a little surprised. Yi Mubai looked at her and curled his lips slightly. She did not know what that smile meant, so she continued to cut her vegetables and said in a low voice, Xiangnan is still young. He's a little picky. Chapter 36:17. Wen Yuan was cutting vegetables. Her movements were a little slower, and her voice was clear. Did Xiangnan tell you? Yi Mubai didn't answer. She continued to cut vegetables and said, I discussed it with Mulan. Don't you think it's too selfish? For your dream? He was a little cynical. Your dream is to play the piano well, and then play for others. You think 2 million yuan is enough for you? Wen Yuan's face was a little pale. She turned around and looked at Yi Mubai. What do you mean? At this time, the servants in the kitchen saw that the situation was not right. There was a strong smell of gunpowder between second young master and madam, and there was some inexplicable ambiguity. Would an ordinary brother-in-law and sister-in-law talk like this? Not like them, absolutely not. Madam seemed to be a decent person, so the one who was not decent was second young master. There were only 2 of them in the kitchen, so there was no need to be polite. Yi Mubai's voice was very soft. If it's inconvenient for you to tell my brother, I can give it to you. When he spoke, he was very close to her, and his hot breath blew on her skin. Then he saw that the skin around her ears was faintly red. Yi Mubai was not a man who was very sexual. He could usually refuse the women who were sent to his door, and even he and Lin Shui had never had sex. But at this time, when he saw the dignified woman in front of him blushing, he couldn't help but stretch out his hand and gently touch her earlobe. As soon as he touched her, her body trembled. When Yuan lowered her head to cut vegetables, her voice was very low and a little hoarse. Why did you give me money? Yi Mubai, you told me to stay away from you. You gave me money to buy me? Do you want me to accompany you to bed and make love? Do you want to sleep with my brother's wife? She said it naturally. After that, she looked up at him with a penetrating gaze. Yi Mubai immediately grabbed her wrist and narrowed his eyes. Is this another trick to seduce me? When Yuan bit her lips. Let me go, I'm your sister-in-law. Not only did he not let her go, he even pulled her into his arms. This was the kitchen, and there were many people walking around. If they were not careful, they might be seen. He would have to be crazy to do this. Yi Mubai lowered his head, and his lips were very close to hers. He said in a low voice, "What kind of woman would say such words to my uncle? Or did you want to do it with me from the beginning? If my brother can't satisfy you, you can only endure it. If I find out that you've been fooling around outside, I'll kill you." After saying that, he let go of her and said in a cold voice, "You're so vain. You're not worthy of my big brother." Wen Yuan looked at him and suddenly said, "Yi Mubai, this is you." He froze for a moment. Wen Yuan lowered his head and continued chopping vegetables with trembling fingers, as if nothing had happened. As the mistress of the house and the daughter-in-law of the Yi family, she could only swallow what had just happened. She would be the only one who would be embarrassed if things got out of hand. Yi Mubai took a cup and poured some water. When he was about to turn around, Yi Mulan's voice came from behind him. "What dishes have you prepared? Xiangnan asked me to come and see." Wen Yuan's body stiffened for a moment. She felt a little uncomfortable. She had no morals at all because there was nothing between her and Yi Mulan. However, Yi Mubai was different. He hugged his sister-in-law just now. Did his brother see it? Chapter 36:18. Yi Mulan was very close to Wen Yuan and held her waist with one hand. "Don't make too many dishes. Don't work too hard." Wen Yuan wasn't used to Yi Mulan being so close to her. Her body was trembling instinctively, but in Yi Mubai's eyes, it was a sign of guilt. Yi Mulan immediately let go of Wen Yuan and talked to Yi Mubai, as if nothing had happened. Yi Mubai felt that he should stay away from Wen Yuan. At least, he shouldn't be too close to her. She was too dangerous. On the way back to the living room, he said to Yi Mulan, "I heard from Xiangnan that Wen Yuan is going to New York to study music for a year or two." Yi Mulan passed a cigarette to Yi Mubai and smiled faintly. "Yes, I have to support Wen Yuan's hobby." Yi Mubai blurted out, "Then you don't have to worry?" Yi Mulan didn't seem to understand his true meaning. He took a drag and said, "What's there to worry about? Wen Yuan can take good care of Xiangnan. Besides, it's better for Xiangnan to be with her. I'm too busy to take care of him." Yi Mubai coughed. "Aren't you afraid that she'll be in America? After all, she's only in her early 30s. Yi Mulan understood and frowned. "Wen Yuan is a good woman." Yi Mubai clenched his fists. "Brother, if you can, don't be so busy." At this time, Yi Mubai patted his shoulder and said something that would make Yi Mubai explode in anger in the future. "There's no problem with my married life with Wen Yuan, and there's nothing wrong with my body." This was very straightforward. Yi Mubai couldn't say that his sister-in-law seduced him. In fact, he wasn't any better. He was actually seduced. Yi Mulan continued, "Wen Yuan and Xiangnan are in New York. You have to take care of them. After all, Xiangnan is still young." Yi Mubai nodded after a while. He was cursing in his heart. He was very resistant. He even felt that this was Wen Yuan's trick to get close to him on purpose. He was thinking that she wanted him to take care of her, and then take care of her to his bed. What intentions did she have? At this moment, he didn't even realize that when he thought of Wen Yuan, he thought of bed and sex. It was clear that he was the one with impure thoughts. Yi Mubai and Yi Mulan returned to the living room. About half an hour later, they had dinner. Wen Yuan had made 2 dishes, both of which were specially made by Xiangnan. However, Yi Mulan still tried them. Her culinary skills were pretty good, so he took another look at her. He also saw that the wound on her finger had not been bandaged, and it was a little prickly. He remembered that her hands were also used to play the zither, and that Lin Shui cherished her hands to the extreme. However, Wen Yuan's hands were used to hold a kitchen knife, and he didn't seem to care at all. Wasn't playing the piano her dream? Was her dream to be a gunner? He despised her in his heart. At this time, Yi Mulan held Wen Yuan's hand and said in a low voice, "Your hand is hurt. I'll bandage it for you upstairs." Wen Yuan looked up. "No need." Yi Mulan looked at her. His black eyes were silent and full of pressure. Wen Yuan still went upstairs with him. At this moment, Su Fu assisted. Mulan and Wen Yuan are really in love. Hao Yin picked up a piece of fish and gave it to her. "Am I not good to you?" Chapter 36:19. As for children, Hao Yun really didn't care much about it. He didn't even want it. In reality, Su Fu wasn't young anymore. If she had a child, she would face aging, and her physical fitness would decline. She wouldn't have time to enjoy life. He didn't care if she was old or ugly, but he wanted Su Fu to be happy for the rest of her life, not to be used to carry on the Hao family's bloodline. What he wanted was a Su Fu, not a tool to give birth to children. Su Fu understood this. So after she went through menopause, she didn't insist on taking care of her body. Instead, she let nature take its course. The things between them had always been good, and it didn't decrease because of her body. It was probably because Hao Yun was gentle enough to her. Every time, it was beautiful, and she felt like she was being cherished. Of course, other than the fact that he would inevitably be a little rude after drinking, she didn't hate it. She felt that he made her want to hug him more at that time. But she never said it. That was good. Or else he would always want to drink. Upstairs, Yi Mulan closed the door of the study and brought the medicine box for Wen Yuan. As he bandaged her, he asked, "What's going on?" Wen Yuan gasped in pain and said, "He said I seduced him." Yi Mulan smiled. "Do you have one?" "Yes." Wen Yuan told the truth and couldn't help but sigh. Mubai has changed a lot. He wasn't like this in the past. In the past, Mubai was always gentle, but now, he was very resistant to her, and even a little disgusted. Perhaps, she thought, it was because he was subconsciously repulsed by her as a person, that he had not entirely forgotten her, that his consciousness had resisted her existence because she had contrived to conceive the child. They had parted on bad terms when he had learned that she had broken the condom. They had quarreled earlier in the morning, more than violently. Later he went to Yunnan. When she found out that she was pregnant and wanted to find him, she couldn't find him anymore. He forgot about her, he forgot about everything. He accepted his family, but he resisted her. Wen Yuan was a delicate woman. She keenly felt this, so she wouldn't easily reveal her cards to him. Not to mention that he had Lin Shuai by his side. She was willing to gamble once. She raised her eyes and looked at Yi Mulan. She whispered, "Mulan, go find Bai Xueli. Don't let her wait for too long. The feeling of waiting isn't good." Yi Mulan bandaged her wound and smiled faintly. She will come back eventually. Now that the one from the Bai family was back, she couldn't just not go home. He had no intention of forgiving her for leaving without saying goodbye. At the very least, he would give her a good spanking. He smiled and looked at Wen Yuan. "When are you leaving?" Wen Yuan turned his face away and looked out the window. Then he said softly, "Yi Mulan, maybe you're right. My life shouldn't just be about Yi Mubai. I should also plan for myself in Xiangnan." She smiled faintly. "Get him. If he doesn't love me, I don't think I will want him." Because his cold words made her realize that they couldn't just roll in the sheets. Just like in the past, when she had done it with him, the gentle and kind Yi Mubai had never thought of marrying her. In his heart, there had always been a little fairy called Lin Sisi. So his current girlfriend was also surnamed Lin. This was probably a subconscious choice. Actually, Wen Yuan would rather that person be Lin Sisi. That way, he would at least be happy, and she would be able to give up. Chapter 36:20. Yi Mulan patted Wen Yuan's shoulder and comforted him. "You have a child with him. You're Wen Yuan. You could handle him in the past, and you can do it in the future. I believe you." As for Lin Sisi, Mubai wouldn't stand a chance. Lin Sisi and Gu Zhe had been messy for so many years, but they hadn't completely broken off. It would be impossible to say that they didn't have any feelings for each other. Wen Yuan smiled faintly and moved his hand. "Good bandaging." Yi Mulan smiled too. "It's all right." The two of them went downstairs, one in front and the other behind. They looked like a loving couple. Yi Mubai sat there and stared at them from the moment they went downstairs. His expression was a little profound. Yi Mulan pretended not to see it. He helped Wen Yuan to his seat, and even helped her to put the dishes on the table. "Your hand is injured." Wen Yuan smiled faintly. Yi Mubai's brows were deeply furrowed. After the meal, they chatted for a long time. Su Fu wanted to ask Yi Mubai to stay at her place for a few days. Yi Mubai said faintly, "Mom, I have to go back to New York tomorrow." Su Fu's face was instantly filled with disappointment. She was extremely beautiful, and when she was unhappy, men would feel especially sorry for her. It wasn't just Hao Yun, even Yi Zhengang felt the same way. Hao Yun was gentle. He comforted his wife. Su Fu, Mubai will come back in the future. It's not like you won't see him again. Children have their own lives. Su Fu patted his hand. How can you understand my feelings? Hao Yun smiled bitterly. Yi Zhengang was a little excited. That's right. Mubai was his and Su Fu's son. He had nothing to do with Hao Yun, so of course he couldn't understand the feelings of a parent. Thus he pretended to say, yeah, Hao Yun, you've never had a child, so you can't understand how Su Fu and I feel. However, Su Fu didn't fall for it. She glanced at him and said coldly, I don't know who forced him to learn to be a director. Otherwise, he wouldn't have fallen so badly that his parents couldn't recognize him. Su Fu was still sad. After all, she had experienced the pain of losing her beloved son and needed Mubai by her side. Yi Mubai had forgotten, but it was in the nature of a mother and a son. Seeing such a beautiful and weak mother pleading, his heart softened and he lowered his voice. Okay, I'll stay for 2 more days, but I won't disturb you and Uncle Hao. I'll just stay here. Su Fu was a little sad again. Yi Mubai took a breath and changed his words. If you're not afraid that I'll disturb you, it's fine. I work during the day, and your mother is bored at home, Hao Yun said gently. It was settled. At 10 p.m., Yi Mulan and Wen Yuan stood side by side to send the guests off. Hao Yun drove, and Su Fu pulled Yi Mubai into the back seat. Only Yi Zhengang stood there a little lost. It was lonely not being at home. He watched as Su Fu and Mubai left. He wanted to grab hold of them, but he could only grab the air. It wasn't until the car was out of sight that he sighed. Mulan, I was wrong, wasn't I? Your mother treats me like air when she sees me now. She doesn't even care about me. Yi Mulan smiled faintly. Maybe. His gaze met his father's. One was in his twilight years, and the other was like the sun in the sky. Yi Zhengang looked at his eldest son. He could vaguely see himself in the past, high-spirited and vigorous. Mulan was still young, not even 40 years old. He still had unlimited possibilities. Thinking of this, he felt that he wasn't wrong. Chapter 36:21. He asked in a low voice. Mulan, are you happy? Are you tired of being in this position? Tired. Yi Mulan exhaled, then looked at Wen Yuan and said gently, bring Xiangnan back first. It's getting late. Xiangnan is going to sleep soon. Wen Yuan nodded, then looked at Yi Zhengang and smiled. Xiangnan, say goodnight to Grandpa. Xiangnan was a small child. He went over and hugged Yi Zhengang. Yi Zhenggang's cold heart was finally warmed up. He kissed his eldest grandson and said, Xiangnan, go to sleep. He looked at Xiangnan. The more he looked at him, the more he looked like a young Mulan. He must have a bright future ahead of him. Yi Zhenggang's expression became even gentler. Wen Yuan smiled and carried Xiangnan into the main house. Only Yi Zhengang and Yi Mulan were left in the parking lot. Yi Zhengang wanted to leave, but seeing that his son seemed to have something to say, he didn't leave. Mu Lin took out a cigarette and lit one for each of them. As the old man, he was once again overwhelmed by the favor. However, this kind of favor was not a good thing. As he smoked, he asked carefully, Mu Lin, are you telling me now that you don't want to work anymore? What do I want to do? Yi Mulan tilted his head and asked him. He smiled faintly. I don't like it, but I know that it's not easy to quit this position. He puffed out clouds of smoke and said in a faint voice, Father, you know in your heart how many people I have to step on in order to climb to this position. How many people will hate me, hate the Yi clan, and even implicate the Wen clan and Uncle Hao clan. With so many things involved, do you think I can escape unscathed? Yi Zhengang patted his shoulder. I know the pressure. Yi Mulan stared at him with a deep gaze. He suddenly said, Dad, Xueli has a child. It should be mine. Yi Zhengang was shocked. It had been so long. Why was Bai Xueli brought up again? And a child? Without thinking, he said, no matter what you think, don't even think about divorcing Wen Yuan. Xiangnan is so cute, just like you when you were young. Xiangnan is Mubai's child. Yi Milan said faintly. Yi Zhenggang choked on the smoke. What did you say? When Yuan and I are just nominal. Before we got married. When Yuan was pregnant with Mubai's child. But Mubai didn't know about it. Now, he doesn't even remember what happened between him and Wen Yuan. Also, Yi Milan paused. Wen Yuan and I are divorced. Secretary Li just finished the paperwork. Yi Zhenggang's hand froze in midair with the cigarette in his hand. He didn't come back to his senses for a long time. After a long time he suddenly said, Yi Milan, you bastard. What else? Let Wen Yuan marry someone else with Mubai's child? Yi Milan laughed coldly. She has always liked Mubai, and will marry him in the future. I'm just telling you the truth. Yi Zhenggang was really angry. He kept saying, You did it for Bai Xueli, didn't you? You did it for her. Yi Milan didn't deny it. Yes, I did it for her. So Dad, this is the best outcome. Yi Zhenggang gritted his teeth. Have you thought about the consequences of divorcing Wen Yuan? Chapter 36-22. The information that Yi Zhenggang received was too much for him to digest. He shook his head and sighed. Milan, you've grown up. Now, he didn't know what to say. In the end he sighed. You still want to be with Bai Xueli. That means that you hate me. Yi Milan's voice had a tinge of repression. Dad, this has nothing to do with hating you. I just can't stop myself from loving her. Just like how you love Mom. Yi Zhenggang glared at his son. After a long while he said softly, Have you ever thought that there might be a Sufu by Bai Xueli's side? Maybe that child isn't yours anymore. It's someone else's. Even if it's someone else's, I'll snatch her over and make her mine. Yi Milan's tone was very calm. He looked at Yi Zhenggang and said softly, Dad, the only difference between you and me is that I put Xueli first, but you've always put power first. Yi Zhenggang's face looked much older in the dark. He took a deep puff of his cigarette and said in a low voice, Milan, do as you see fit. As he spoke, he patted Yi Milan's shoulder and smiled bitterly. Sometimes, when I see you so successful, I feel proud. But when I look at you behind the scenes, when I look at your mother, I feel like a failure. Yi Zhenggang's voice was a little choked. He couldn't continue. He closed his eyes. Milan, I'll go back first. He actually didn't dare to face his own failure. What a joke. A person like him, Yi Zhenggang, was actually a failure in the end. He had nothing and his family was torn apart. After that, he walked to his car with unsteady steps. Yi Milan stopped him. Dad. Yi Zhenggang turned around and smiled bitterly. Milan, do as you see fit. Yi Milan walked over and smiled. Let me send you. Yi Zhenggang was a little surprised. Yi Milan was already walking towards the car. You're not in a good mood. Let me send you. When Yi Zhenggang came back to his senses, he was already in the car. It seemed to be his first time sitting in Mulin's car. Yi Milan drove unsteadily as he said calmly, Dad, you don't have to be alone all the time. Mom is with Uncle Hao now. You can totally find someone to accompany you. Yi Zhenggang said somewhat angrily, Since your mother has found someone, I have to find someone. I won't find anyone. I just like someone and I'm fine. Yi Milan smiled and did not say much to him. Anyway, he would look for him when he could not take it anymore. There was no need to be anxious about such things. He sent Yi Zhenggang back to the old house and watched his father walk in. He stood by the car for a while and recalled the time when he had just married Bai Xueli. He went home every day because his wife was waiting for him. At that time, he thought he hated her because she was useless, and she was still useless now. But he still wanted to go home, and he wanted to have sex with her. His Adam's apple moved a little as he thought of the past. Yi Milan smiled and looked up at the night sky, thinking about the woman who had disappeared for a few years. He missed her and hated her at the same time. After a long time, he still drove away. He did not go back to the villa immediately, but wandered around casually. His identity actually did not allow him to do this, but tonight he thought of her like this. The car drove past the places they had passed, and every bit of it seeped into his memory. When the car stopped next to a barbecue shop, he just looked over casually, and his heart suddenly skipped a beat. It was exactly the same as a few years ago. She was sitting by the window, and beside her was Lin Cece and a little person. Chapter 36:23. Yi Mulan's heart almost stopped. He looked straight at her, at the little person beside her. It looked like him. It was his child. His eyes suddenly felt warm. It was an inexplicable feeling. He just looked at her, watching her talk to Lin Cece freely, watching her eat in a refined manner. She was still different from before. And the little thing beside her was very obedient and extremely beautiful. His son. How could she bring her son out for barbecue in the middle of the night? Damn it. Yi Mulan narrowed his eyes and forgot to drive. He only snapped out of it when the car behind him honked. When he parked the car at the side and got out to take a look, Lin Cece had already paid the bill. Bai Shuili was a freeloader. After so many years she was still freeloading. He felt embarrassed for her. Yi Mulan stood in the dark outside. Only a little light shone on his face. Even though he felt that the timing wasn't right, even though he felt that someone would recognize him, he still stood there without any hesitation, waiting for her. After Lin Cece paid the bill, she walked out holding Xiao Xiao's hand and saw Yi Mulan standing by the door. She was stunned for a moment. Then she turned and said to Bai Shuili, "Yi Mulan." "What?" Bai Shuili had been walking with her eyes down. Suddenly she saw Yi Mulan. Her eyes froze and she couldn't speak for a long time. Yi Mulan looked at her deeply and said softly, "Let's talk in the car." He didn't even look at his son. He only said to Lin Cece, "Help me take care of my son." He didn't even ask and was sure that this was his son. Lin Cece was impressed by his courage and confidence. She wanted to laugh too. She coughed lightly. "I don't have any objections." With that said, she glanced at Bai Shuili. Bai Shuili couldn't move her eyes away. She kept looking at Yi Mulan. With his status, it wasn't appropriate for him to stay any longer. There were already two people looking at him, so he grabbed her hand and dragged her to his car, ignoring his son. Lin Cece looked down at the little person she was holding inside. "Your father must have accidentally broken the condom. Otherwise, it's a gift from Double 11. The little girl was about to cry. She watched helplessly as her mother was snatched away. Lin Cece squatted down. "All right, Mommy will pick you up tomorrow. Can Auntie sleep tonight?" She had long wanted to monopolize such a cute little kiss. As she spoke, she even kissed him fiercely. Tonight she had all night. Lin Cece's smile was a little perverted. On the other side, Bai Shuili had just regained her senses. She struggled hard and said, "Let go of me, Yi Mulan. Let go of me, do you hear me?" However, he didn't. Instead, he threw her into the back seat and immediately got in the car and started it. His actions were so fast that she couldn't react in time. Bai Shuili felt her head hurting. She got up from the back seat and glared at the back of his head. "Shou Yi, have you forgotten that you have a wife? Ex-husband and ex-wife are just reminiscing about old times. What are you thinking about?" He seemed to have calmed down. He drove with one hand, lit a cigarette, and took a long drag. Chapter 36:24. He chuckled in a self-deprecating manner, but he didn't speak to her. Soon, she realized that he had driven the car to the city, the apartment they used to live in. The car stopped, but she refused to get out. She patted the window on the other side and said hoarsely, "I don't want to get out. Yi Mulan, think about your status now. It's not good for you to have an affair in marriage if it gets out. Your dad used to have a woman too. There's nothing bad about it," he said harshly, deliberately not explaining that he and Wen Yuan had been faking their marriage and divorce. The divorce certificate was still warm this morning. He just didn't want to tell her that he was still angry at her. But a man was a man. Even though he was angry, there were some things that he couldn't be careless about and couldn't resist. So when he found her and caught her, it only took him 1 second to decide to come here. He didn't even care about his son, since he wouldn't be able to run away. If necessary, he could have 2 more children with Bai Shuili. He wanted a child. He liked the child the moment he saw her. She liked to run and she had legs. He didn't mind making her pregnant, so that she couldn't run away. With that thought in mind, he dragged her out of the car with one hand. Bai Shuili's voice was hoarse. "Yi Mulan, don't force me. I'll really scream. Save your strength for a call later," he said quite directly and roughly, holding her, his eyes passing over her face. Yeah, she still looked the way he liked. She was a little more mature, but still fair and tender. She probably didn't suffer much outside. Just like that, he dragged her to the elevator. He couldn't help but press her down and kiss her deeply. She didn't want to, so he pinched her cheeks and forced her to open her mouth. They kissed passionately until the elevator stopped at the top floor. The moment they got out of the elevator, he hugged her with one hand and opened the door to the apartment while kissing her. He didn't even turn on the lights and pressed her against the door. She struggled with all her might, but it was useless. His breath, his scent, everything about him assaulted her senses. She didn't know what to do, but she had to accept it. He was so strong that he wanted to tear her apart. A man who had been alone for a long time was probably like this. Hungry and thirsty. 2 minutes later, everything stopped. Not only her, but he was also surprised. Under her shocked and watery gaze, he kissed the corner of her lips and said softly, "One more time." "No." Baishueli turned her head to the side to avoid him. In the apartment it was dark. No one could see each other clearly. They could only feel that each other's eyes were glistening with tears. "Yi Mulin, let go of me. Pretend none of this happened." She sounded like she was about to cry, and she was a little embarrassed. In her heart, he was a married man, and she had slept with him now. Whether it was voluntary or not, she was embarrassed. She did not want to look at him, so she avoided him. In the dark, her senses were especially sensitive. She could smell a faint floral fragrance. Her nose twitched slightly. Yi Mulin said in a low voice, "It's white roses. Sisterly comes here every day, just like before." She was stunned. Then she started to cry. She leaned against the door and cried softly. She looked at him and sobbed. "Yi Mulin, what are you doing?" He gazed into her eyes in the dark and said softly, "I want you, do you understand?" Chapter 36:25. Yi Mulin looked at her, his voice low and husky. "Didn't you miss me?" With that said, he removed the rest of her clothes in a perverted manner and looked at her. That gaze was rather perverted. It was as though he was looking at everything, as though he couldn't wait to take a microscope and examine every pore. Not only that, he was the same. He even brought her to see him. In the huge space, there was only their light breaths on each other's faces. He touched her face, bit by bit, then picked her up and carried her straight to what had once been their bedroom, throwing her onto the luxurious king-sized bed. The middle of the bed sunk in. She moved in fear and shrank to the headboard, but it was no use. He dragged her over. Without turning on the lights, he pressed down on her and asked for it over and over again. Even when her voice was hoarse from crying, he didn't let her go. And no matter how slow she was, she could tell that he was trying to get her pregnant on purpose. Not only did he not use protection, but he also made it easier for her to get pregnant. Every time she screamed for him not to do it, he pressed down on her and kissed her, forcing her to accept everything. For the whole night he almost didn't let her go. At 1 o'clock in the night, when Yuan called. As his wife, she probably had to show some concern. Yi Mulin was feeling hot. After receiving the call, he glanced at Baishueli and answered it in front of her. He said calmly, "I won't be coming back tonight. You and Xiangnan should sleep early." No one knew what Wen Yuan said, but he chuckled and looked at Baishueli. He had been at it for 2 hours. He wasn't as anxious as before. He seemed to be taking his time, and seemed to be punishing her. He spoke absent-mindedly and didn't miss a beat. Baishueli was extremely embarrassed. She bit her lip so hard that it almost broke. Then, she bit her clenched fist, tears welling up in the corner of her eyes. She was extremely embarrassed. Then he hung up the phone and threw it aside. Then he looked at her expressionlessly and said, "Let's continue." Baishueli turned her head and choked. "Yi Mulin, you got the person you wanted. Let me leave. I won't be an outsider." "Really?" He chuckled lightly. "You have a backbone now. Your dad came out to talk to me about integrity. Have you forgotten how you used to cry and beg to crawl into my bed?" "Baishueli, this isn't the first time Wen Yuan has existed. You weren't like this when you were in my bed before." He said mockingly, but he didn't let her go. He still had fun. By the time he was satisfied, the sky was about to brighten. She was so tired that she had already collapsed on the bed. Her face was still wet with tears, and her face was pale and ruddy. Yi Mulan was tired from the night before, but he couldn't fall asleep at all. He was still very excited. He reached out and touched her face lightly. Without much expression on his face, he muttered, "You must think that I'm crazy." "Yes, I'm crazy. Bai Shueli, you have no idea how I got through these nights alone." He added, "I really want to kill you." Of course, he could not bear to kill her. He could only bear to love her to death. He collapsed, still holding her possessively in his arms. She was very tired now, and very good, and would do as he pleased. In fact, when she had fainted earlier, he had still taken her by force, repeatedly taking her. Chapter 36-26. Early in the morning, Yi Mulan woke up instinctively. He looked at the time. It was 7 o'clock. He should have gotten up by now because he had so many things to do and was very busy. He lay on the pillow and thought for a moment. Then he called Secretary Li and said, "I'll be at the office at 10 o'clock. Cancel all my previous appointments." Secretary Li heard his voice was a little hoarse and asked with concern, "Chief Shou, are you feeling unwell?" Yi Mulan looked at the woman who was sleeping soundly. His voice was hoarse and sexy. "No, I'm too comfortable." "Ah." Secretary Li's mouth fell open, but she understood after a while. Bai Shueli was back. Otherwise, how could Chief Shou be comfortable? She tried hard not to laugh and said in a businesslike manner, "Okay, I'll make the arrangements. There's no end to work. As long as you're happy." Yi Mulan hung up the phone and used his arm as a pillow behind his head. After a while, he looked at the woman in his arms. He was annoyed and satisfied. He lowered his head and bit the tip of her nose. She could actually still sleep. What a pig. She hadn't changed at all. She was already a mother, but she hadn't changed at all. He was annoyed but happy that she hadn't changed at all. He bit the tip of her nose again. Bai Shueli bit her lip and snuggled into his arms. "Stop it." He stared at her for a long time before lying flat and closing his eyes. When he woke up again, he was woken up by a commotion. Bai Shueli quietly moved away from his arms. Just as she was about to move away, he woke up and held her in his arms again. He looked at the time. It was already past 10 o'clock. He cursed under his breath and dialed Secretary Li's number. "I'll go to the office in the afternoon." Secretary Li replied appropriately. "Okay, I've already made the arrangements. You don't have any appointments in the morning. Send my regards to Miss Bai." Yi Mulan hung up the phone with a smile. He looked at the person in his arms and said expressionlessly, "I just went to the office in the afternoon. How many more times should we do it now?" Bai Shueli was furious. She glared at him. "Yi Mulan, are you hyperactive?" She casually took his black shirt from the side and put it on. He allowed her to do as she pleased, but when she walked past him, the visual impact was still quite big. It couldn't be seen through his loose collar and waist. He took hold of her again and drew her close to him. "Let's talk." As he spoke, he took a cigarette from the side, lit it, and took a puff. "Let's talk about the conditions." Bai Shueli looked at him and gritted her teeth. "I'm not selling." "Is that so? You slept with me for free? When did you become so generous?" He looked at her and blew a puff of smoke on her face. Bai Shueli was so angry that she kicked him a few times. "Yi Mulan, you old man. You're so greasy now." Every time he opened his mouth, he would make dirty jokes. Yi Mulan looked at her and smiled. "You don't like me?" He paused for a moment and pinched her chin. "These years you've been with Gu Changfeng." Actually, he could feel that she had never had a man before. She was very inexperienced. He should have been gentler last night. She must have been hurt because of him. Thinking of this, Yi Mulan pulled her over and stretched out his hand. Bai Shueli screamed, "What are you doing?" Chapter 36-27. Bai Shueli lay in his arms pathetically, her voice hoarse. "Yi Mulan, you jerk." His voice was hoarse. "Don't move." Then he rolled over, held her down, and examined her inside and out. Bai Shueli's face was twisted to the side. "Have you had enough?" His gaze was more scorching than his touch. She couldn't move at all, her limbs weak. Yi Mulan didn't let her go after checking. Instead, he lay down, one hand still holding her waist. Was the baby born naturally? She didn't make a sound. He leaned close to her and said in a low voice, "I didn't feel anything." She was a little confused, not knowing what he meant. Yi Mulan said again in a low voice, "It's the same as before. It's very comfortable." That was definitely what a pervert would say. She turned her face away, feeling a little embarrassed. Just then when Yuan called, he glanced at her but still picked it up. "Wen Yuan, how was Xiangnan's kindergarten interview?" he asked calmly. Actually, Xiangnan was going to go abroad with Wen Yuan soon. This was just a form of training. Wen Yuan smiled and said, "It's pretty good. Are you coming back for dinner? I made dumplings myself." Yi Mulan stared at Bai Shueli. Bai Shueli heard it too. She glared at him, her eyes misty. Then Yi Mulan said softly, "I'll be a little late tonight. I'll go back at 8. Let Xiangnan eat something first. The child can't be hungry." Wen Yuan agreed gently and didn't say anything else. Bai Shueli was watching the daily warmth of a couple. She was embarrassed and angry, turning her face away and not saying a word. Yi Mulan hung up and looked at her. Jerk. Bai Shueli pushed him away and went to the bathroom with red eyes. Her legs turned to jelly, but she still went to the bathroom. She turned on the hot water and took a shower, thinking about what had happened last night. Perhaps returning to City B was a mistake. Perhaps she should go back to America. As she was thinking, a pair of arms hugged her waist from behind. Then he pressed his whole body against her, his face buried in her delicate neck. "Are you angry? Because of Wen Yuan?" "I don't have the right to be angry, but I have the right to leave, right?" Bai Shueli's eyes were still a little red. She was even more angry. He was clearly married, so why did he have to provoke her? The man behind her chuckled softly. "You are qualified, but it depends on whether I agree or not. Bai Shueli, you should know that I can do whatever I want with my position today, including you and our son, right?" She froze for a moment. He finally mentioned an N. "Not a son, a daughter." Bai Shueli turned her head in his arms. Her eyes were a little red and her face was wet. She said very seriously, "Bai Anan, my daughter has nothing to do with the Yi family." She paused. "Your son is Yi Xiangnan. Wen Yuan gave birth to him on your behalf." There was a hint of blame in her tone, as well as a hint of anger. Yi Mulan stared at her and smiled. "Who was the one who left without saying goodbye back then?" "Bai Shueli, do you know how long I've been looking for you? I couldn't find you, and when Yuan got pregnant, I married her, and now you want me to divorce her because of you?" Her eyes reddened and she bit her lip. "Yi Mulan, you bastard." Chapter 36-28. Bai Shueli looked at him fiercely. "You want me to be your affair?" She couldn't believe it and then shouted, "Yi Mulan, I'm telling you, don't even think about it." "What if I insist?" He glanced at her. "Bai Shaosan." Bai Shueli was furious that he still dared to call her that. She stretched out her foot to kick him, but it was her leg that hurt. He didn't feel any pain, so she glared at him with red eyes. Yi Mulan grabbed her with one hand and said in a stern voice, "Stop fooling around. Go to Lin Cece's place to pick up an N. You're called Bai Anan, right?" He muttered to himself, "Bai Anan, Yianan, what a strange name. Bai Shaosan, I keep telling you to read more books but you won't listen." Bai Shueli was furious. She turned around and ignored him, washing herself silently. Yi Mulan's gaze softened when she couldn't see him, and the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. However, he didn't say anything, nor did he coax her. She had been gone for so long, and he really didn't want to coax her. After washing, they went out to put on their clothes silently. He asked her to make breakfast, and she didn't resist. It was still the same as before. Everything was arranged the same as before, and she could use it easily. She was a little absent-minded as she made breakfast. She had met her ex-husband less than 3 days after returning to the country. It was just a meeting with Cece. Did he have to be so amazing? Yi Mulan walked over, lit a cigarette, and leaned against the side to smoke. "What are you thinking about?" She shook her head and looked at him. "Have you been following me? If I can follow you, do you think you can always be free and happy outside?" He blew out a mouthful of smoke, and the light gray smoke blocked each other's sight. At this moment, they were both thinking that it had been almost 3 years. It turned out that they had been separated for almost 3 years. Bai Shueli was a little stunned. When she came back to her senses, she said lightly, "You're the free and happy person. Is it interesting to marry Wen Yuan and find me at the same time?" Yi Mulan walked over and pressed against her. "Your Lao Qing is back too." Ah. She looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he meant. "Yi Mubai, your little white." He snorted softly, then snorted again. "Are you happy? Are you surprised?" She still looked at him. She looked at him for a long time and said gloomily, "You're really different from how you look on TV." He pretended to be gentle and modest on TV. He was simply the most outstanding part of the young leaders. He was not greasy, did not have a belly, and had a good appearance. Who knew how many young women were especially fascinated by him? They felt that he was elegant and extremely charming. Actually, in private, he was extremely vile. She looked at him like this. Yimu chuckled. "What's different? You're naked. You're different from before, huh? Why are you acting like a hooligan now?" Bai Shueli bit her lips and glared at him. Yi Mulan smiled again. "How is it compared to before?" He approached her without a sound, and she had nowhere to retreat. Her body was pressed against the counter, his solid body in front of her. It was a bit shameful for them to stick together like that. Bai Shueli bit her lip and stared at him. "You should ask Wen Yuan." She blurted it out in a panic. Chapter 36-29. Her lips trembled, but he was still looking at her. His fingers caressed her velvety lips, and he leaned over to whisper, "Why aren't you asking anymore? Are you afraid or are you jealous? Are you afraid that we've really slept together, HM?" "I didn't." She turned her face away. She was extremely angry and disappointed. Actually, whether it was real or fake, he was someone else's husband. He was Wen Yuan's husband. He and Wen Yuan were like Yi Zhenggang and Su Fu back then, and she was playing the role of Bai Shaosan. She didn't want it to be like this. She felt aggrieved and turned her face to the side, choking. "Can you let me go? You have a wife and a child now. You can have any woman you want. If you like her, you can raise her. My wife likes my younger brother, and the child belongs to someone else. They might still be together. I can't accept it, so I feel that I have to have a child too. Bai Shaosan, you're a ready-made one, aren't you?" He looked at her fair and tender face. It was really cute, and he couldn't help but take a small bite. She was clearly a woman in her early 30s. She didn't put on any makeup, and her face was clean, fair, and soft. Had she been eating yogurt all these years? She didn't seem to have aged at all. As for him, he knew very well in his heart that although he looked the same, he had actually aged a lot. His heart was no longer the same as before. After going through so much, he didn't know why he had to wear a mask to work and live every day. But when she came back, he knew. He had been waiting for her all this time. He had never changed. Now that she was back, his heart seemed to be filled with warmth, and he seemed to be a little younger. His words almost made Bai Shueli explode. "Yi Mulan, don't you have any shame? If your wife wants to run away, why are you pestering me? You'll feel more comfortable doing it," he said, hugging her in an instant and sticking close to her, letting her feel him. She was a little suffocated, speechless, and angry. He was really shameless. She glared at him and he smiled. "Can you deny that you enjoyed it last night? You obviously liked it too." She didn't deny it, and turned her face away uncomfortably. "That only proves that you're skilled." Then she said with some disdain, "It shows that you have a lot of experience and can sleep with anyone." Yi Mulan smiled. "Is that so, little Bai San? Then I'll properly let you feel the skills I've honed in?" She looked at him angrily as he walked to the dining table. "You've been promoted quite a bit, and your skin has become thicker." He sat down casually and started eating breakfast. Actually, it was already lunch, but because he was too hungry, he didn't care too much about it. He looked at her as he ate. "Aren't you going to sit down?" Bai Shueli sat down and said in a low voice, "I won't be your mistress. You can forget about it." "You want me to divorce Wen Yuan?" He stared at her. "Really? I didn't." She bit her lips. "Yi Mulan, not every woman wants to be Mrs. Yi. I just want to be an ordinary person now." Chapter 36-30. She paused. "Please don't tell Anan that you are her father." She will be disappointed if she expects too much. He finally understood what she was trying to say. He frowned. You mean that you will find a stepfather for her in the future? Bai Shuali lowered her eyes. Gu Changfeng has proposed to me. Yi Mulan's face turned cold as soon as she finished speaking. He stared at her. You agreed, he added. Are you with him? Does Gu Changfeng mind if you sleep with me? Bai Shuali shook her head. If you force me too much, I will marry him directly. And if Gu Changfeng forces me again, I don't mind exposing you. Really? Exposing me and ruining my reputation? He smiled and took out his phone from his pocket. Give me your phone. She didn't know what he was going to do. He had already added her on WeChat and sent a video to her. Bai Shuali opened it and deleted it immediately. Her face turned pale. Yi Mulan, you are a pervert. He stared at her little face, got up and walked to the study. He took out a stack of documents from the safe and threw them in front of her. These are enough for me to stay in jail until I die of old age. If you report me, I won't be able to pester you anymore once I'm in jail. Bai Shuali was at a loss. She glared at him. Yi Mulan, are you crazy? His eyes were burning and he said coldly, if you dare to let Gu Changfeng touch you, Bai Shuali, I will make sure that you won't regret it. She was furious. You are a jerk. She couldn't say anything else. She was just angry and didn't want to talk to him. Yi Mulan stared at her. Aren't you going to expose me? These are the evidence. Do you think I don't dare to? Bai Shuali said that, but she didn't dare to touch those documents. Yi Mulan sneered inside. She was still as timid as before. She was scared by a few pieces of paper. He put away the documents and didn't say anything else. He was obviously angry at her and Gu Changfeng. Bai Shuali finished her breakfast quietly. Yi Mulan took the key and walked out. He looked at her deeply. Let's go. He was wearing a gray turtleneck sweater and a black cotton coat, which made him look much younger than he did on TV. When he walked out, it was unlikely that he would be recognized. Bai Shuali narrowed her eyes and said softly, Can you let me go? She sniffed. I don't want to be your mistress. I don't want people to talk behind my back. There was no expression on Yi Mulan's face. After a long time he smiled faintly. I need to think about it. Bai Shuali, I won't let my son, daughter live in someone else's house. I won't let her follow you and freeload. You and Bai Anan should live here now. I won't come here every day. She bit her lip. Is this any different from keeping him? He sneered. I'm raising Bai Anan. You're the nanny I hired. The nanny won't let me sleep, she protested in a small voice. Yi Mulan laughed. Is that so? Then why did you scream so happily last night? Chapter 36-31. Bai Shuali pushed his hand away awkwardly, not wanting him to touch her. He didn't force her since he wasn't in a hurry. He brought her out, and when they reached the car park, she realized that there were a few cars parked there. They were all the ones he had driven when they got married. And her white BMW. She was a little shocked and mumbled, It's still here. Yi Mulan threw a car key to her. I've been keeping it. I'll come over to stay for a couple of days sometimes. When he was thinking of her. However, Yi Shouja wouldn't say such words easily. He was still angry at her. How could he say such words? He drove a black Audi, a very low-profile car, but the back seat was very spacious, suitable for taking care of children. Bai Shuali sat in the back seat of his car. There was a faint masculine scent in the car. She was sure that Wen Yuan wasn't involved in any of this. What did he mean by this? She refused to think about it. Yi Mulan drove, holding a cigarette in one hand. He said calmly, Why did you raise Anan like a boy? He had watched her for a while last night, but couldn't tell. Bai Shuali stared at him and bit her lip. She said in a low voice, She likes it this way. You're letting her do whatever she wants just because she likes it? Yi Mulan said unhappily, I'll teach her personally. Don't lead my daughter astray. My child has nothing to do with you. Bai Shuali snorted softly, her voice indifferent. Yi Xiannan is your son. Her words were a little out of spite. Yi Mulan smiled and didn't say anything. He just focused on driving. Lin Cece didn't go to work that day because she wanted to take care of Bai Anan. Lin Cece had thought that it was a young boy at first, but it turned out to be a young lady. She felt that she was blind. How could there be such a cool and handsome young lady? When Bai Shueli went over, Bai Anan was sitting on the sofa reading a children's book, while Lin Sisi was at the side. She looked at her with envy. Bai Shueli was really good at giving birth. She had the best features of both Yi Mulin and Bai Shueli, and her brain had selectively inherited Yi Mulin's genes. She looked exactly like her black-bellied father, but Lin Sisi still liked her very much. She looked at Bai Anan like a little fangirl. Bai Anan looked up. Auntie Lin, you've been looking at me like this for a long time. Because Anan is good-looking. Lin Sisi didn't even try to hide it. Her eyes were fixed on the little fellow's face. Bai Anan smiled reservedly. Mom often looks at me like that too. Lin Sisi knew why, so she asked quietly. And, do you miss Dad? Bai Anan looked at Lin Sisi and said softly. Mom said that she gave birth to me alone. Lin Sisi rolled her eyes. Why don't you let her have another one? Just as she was about to brainwash herself, the doorbell rang. She paused for a moment and went to open the door. Sure enough, she saw the adulterous couple from last night at the door. One of them was in high spirits, and the other was obviously in low spirits. Lin Sisi blocked the door and greeted her with a fake smile. Boss Nightless, don't you have to work today? Or are your legs weak? Bai Shueli blushed when she said it so crudely, and without any embellishment. She said softly, Sisi, don't talk nonsense. Chapter 36-32. This topic was too much for her. Bai Shueli popped her head out. Where's Anan? Lin Sisi was still leaning against the door. She glanced at Yi Mulin and asked Bai Shueli, do you want to be the mistress? She sneered at Yi Mulin. Shueli is easy to fool, but I'm not. I'll go back and divorce Wen Yuan before picking them up. Yi Mulin knew that Lin Sisi wasn't someone to be trifled with. He said unhappily, all right, we can go to court. Let's see if Bai Anan's surname is Bai or Yi. Do you dare to cause such a scandal? Lin Sisi stared at him. Yi Mulin chuckled. I can try. Miss Lin, you can try. Can the Lin family withstand the storm? Lin Sisi's face was pale. Although she knew that Yi Mulin wouldn't do that, she still felt that it was too dangerous for Shueli to return to this man's side so easily. He had a wife and a child. Bai Shueli's face was pale. She pulled Lin Sisi's hand and said softly, Sisi, I'll be fine. Lin Sisi was a little sad. She couldn't help Shueli. She might as well not return to China. Yi Mulin could divorce her if he missed her. Why did he have to do this? But Yi Mulin was right. She couldn't stop anything. It wasn't the Lin family. It was the Bai family that couldn't withstand the storm. She could only watch as Bai Shueli and Anan left with Yi Mulin. Bai Anan was calmer than anyone else. She was indifferent to Yi Mulin. She was like a precocious little boy, not a 3-year-old at all. Yi Mulin walked over and squatted down. He smiled. Anan, I'm your father. Bai Anan looked at him and frowned. You look exactly like me. Yi Mulin reached out and touched her little head. You look more like your mother. Looking closely, Bai Anan looked a lot like Shueli. It was just that she looked like him. As he said that, Bai Anan reached out and hugged his neck. Bai Anan wasn't fat. She was tall enough to outshine other children of her age. Yi Mulin hugged her. He was hugging his own flesh and blood. It felt different from hugging Xiangnan. He loved Xiangnan. But for Anan, he had the idea of plucking the stars and the moon for her. He restrained himself. He smiled faintly and hugged Anan and kissed her. He restrained himself. Daddy will take you home, he murmured. Anan leaned on his shoulder and asked softly, do you like Mommy? He smiled and pinched Anan's little face, but he didn't answer. Perhaps it was because children were sensitive. From the way he treated her, she knew that her father liked her mother very much. That was why she was willing to accept Yi Mulin. It was probably because of the atmosphere. Bai Anan and Yi Mulin were together. How harmonious. Yi Mulin hugged Bai Anan, and then looked at Bai Shueli. I'll wait for you in the car. You can come down after you pack up. I've already packed your luggage. He left just like that. After all, he had taken the child with him, and she would definitely leave with him. Yi Mulin carried Bai Anan down the stairs slowly. Anan hugged his neck and kept looking at him. Yi Mulin laughed. Why are you always looking at me like that? Bai Anan leaned her face against his neck and did not speak. She was a little shy. Chapter 36-33. Actually, he did not approve of children eating these things, but he felt that there was no need to be too harsh on his youngest daughter. It was fine as long as she was happy. Upstairs, Baishuali started to pack her luggage. Lin Cece held her hand and asked softly, "Are you really going to be with him?" Baishuali shook her head. "No, I'll find a way to leave and go abroad." Lin Cece frowned. "Aren't you afraid that he'll do something to your parents?" "He won't. Actually, Yi Mulan isn't that bad of a man." Baishuali smiled lightly and continued packing. "Let's put it another way. He's been sacrificing for me for the past few years. If it wasn't for me, he wouldn't have entered this circle. I know he likes being a lawyer." She smiled helplessly. After packing, she looked at Lin Cece. "Cece, I know you care about me, but it's really not that bad. If Anan likes him, maybe they can be together in the future. Anan has to have a father. You want to give Anan to him?" Lin Cece asked incredulously. Baishuali shook her head. "I want to communicate with him. He has a family, and he won't want to lose everything. Smart men know how to choose, especially when he's Yi Mulan." Lin Cece sat on the sofa deep in thought. "You said that Lao Bai is still alive. Do you think he's pranking you? He's doing it on purpose. I've seen normal men cheat on their wives, and I've never seen anyone as righteous as Yi Mulan." Baishuali glared at Lin Cece. Lin Cece raised her hand. "All right, I won't call you Bai Xiaosan." Bai Xiaosan was angry. She pulled her luggage and walked out. Lin Cece stood at the door. "Shueli." Baishuali turned around. Lin Cece smiled faintly. "If you have an argument, come and stay for a few days. If you don't like him, find a man to piss him off." "I know." Baishuali's eyes were a little hot. "Cece, I'm leaving first. We'll meet again later. I'll probably stay in City B for now." Everything depended on the outcome of her negotiation with Yi Mulan. Actually, from Lin Cece's point of view, there was no need to negotiate. They would eventually go to bed. In her heart, Baishuali and Yi Mulan were not on the same level. Yi Mulan could eat Baishuali up without leaving a single bone. Baishuali pulled her suitcase downstairs. When Yi Mulan saw her, he got out of the car and helped her put her in the trunk. Then he opened the door for her and got into the car. He drove himself. The car drove straight back to the condominium. As it was a big condominium of 500 square meters, Baianan was quite happy. She ran back and forth a few times. Yi Mulan even let her sit on his stomach to play games. She giggled happily. Baishuali was packing her luggage in the bedroom. From time to time, she would listen to An's voice outside. Anan rarely laughed like this. She was as restrained as a little boy. Now that she heard it, she felt a little bitter. She had been taking care of Anan alone for the past few years. Although Gu Changfeng had taken care of her, she did not want to trouble others all the time. Sometimes, she had to work, and Anan could only play by himself. She did not know when Anan had become like a boy. Baishuali bit her lips, a little stunned. At this moment, Yi Mulan leaned against the door and looked at her quietly. "What are you thinking about?" Baishuali looked up at him and smiled faintly. "Nothing. I just want to buy some books for Anan later." Oh, she can recognize a lot of words. Chapter 36-34. Baishuali shook her head. "Don't bother her. I like to go out and buy things myself. I want to buy some reference books too." "Reference books?" Yi Mulan raised an eyebrow. He had forgotten to ask her what she had been doing for a living these past few years. It seemed like she hadn't been down and out. Baishuali licked her lips. "I usually take on some translation jobs. You know I can't go around with Anan." He looked at her. "You don't have to work so hard in the future." She looked at him and said softly but firmly, "I like this job." He was a little unhappy. "You can take care of Anan better if you don't work." Baishuali stared at him for a long time before she smiled. "Do you ask Wen Yuan to do the same?" Yi Mulan heard her mention Wen Yuan, and remembered that he had promised Wen Yuan to go back for dumplings. It wasn't Wen Yuan but Xiangnan. Xiangnan was going to America soon, and he couldn't go back on his promise. He paused. "Wen Yuan is different." He then added, When Yuan is going abroad soon and Xiangnan will go with him. I have to go back to the villa tonight. When he finished, he looked into her eyes. Bai Shuili was stunned for a moment. Then she put the book down and didn't say anything. She didn't have the right to say anything. His wife was Wen Yuan. Even if Xiangnan was Xiaobai's child, his spouse was still Wen Yuan. She couldn't tell how she felt. She couldn't hate Wen Yuan either. Everything was her own choice. She was doing it for the Bai family, so she couldn't blame anyone, including Yi Mulan. She didn't hate him, but he might have been blaming her all the time. She could feel it. Bai Shuili remained silent. Yi Mulan lowered his voice. Don't you have anything to say? She shook her head. No. Then she looked up at him for a long time and smiled. That's your home. It's only right for you to go back. Yi Mulan went forward and hooked his arm around her waist. Are you willing to be Bai Shuili's mistress? She glared at him, her eyes burning. Does Boss Yi want to divorce me and marry me? There was a faint smile in his eyes. If you bring it up. I'm not interested in destroying other people's families. She pushed him away. I have to clean up. Yi Mulan did not pester her any further. Instead, he went to look at the books on the bookshelf. Did you translate all of them? She didn't say anything and didn't want to talk to him. He didn't think much of it. He took out a book and read it in Chinese, French, and English. Unexpectedly, her translation of the book was very accurate, and the emotions were also on point. Her ability to speak 8 languages was not just for show. He put down the book. If you go out, drive that white car. I've asked someone to maintain it regularly. Bai Shuili nodded and looked at him. Yi Mulan, I have something to tell you. He looked like he was waiting for her to speak. Bai Shuili pursed her lips and said softly, we can get along in a different way. She looked at Anan, who was standing outside. Anan, you can see him anytime. We can be ordinary friends. Isn't that great? Yi Mulan lit a cigarette. You want to be my friend? We just did it last night. Don't you think it's funny that you're crying under my body? She blushed. You forced me to do it last night. Chapter 36-35. He took a step forward and forced her into a corner. She had nowhere to retreat. He bent down and pressed his lips against her face. What if you have physical needs? She bit her lip and glared at him. After a while she said, it's none of your business. He stared into her eyes and felt that her face was about to emit heat. Then he chuckled. Bai Shuili, I thought you were going to say that you didn't have physical needs. She was a little angry. Her slender hands gently tugged at his sweater, and she looked up into his eyes. Her voice was a little hoarse and charming. I thought you were worried about what I would do if I had physical needs in the next few years. His eyes were as dark as ink, and there was a hint of coldness in them. After a long time, he suddenly pinched her face. It hurts, it hurts, it hurts. Bai Shuili was in so much pain that she stared at him with tears in her eyes. Yi Mulan's face was full of displeasure. Next time you make me unhappy, I won't let you hurt like this, huh? The hint in his words made her face burn again, but she didn't dare to stare at him. Yi Mulan let go of her hand and looked around before whispering, I'll get off work early tomorrow to add some things. Yi Mulan, I won't live with you outside of marriage. She emphasized, her face steaming. He leaned on the side. Do you think I won't get any benefits from supporting you? I can support myself, she immediately retorted. But Yi Mulan frowned. I will let my woman go out and show her face in public. You can continue with your current work, but your biggest job is Anan and me. His male chauvinist nature was clearly exposed. Bai Shuili was furious. I told you that I won't be your mistress. Well, then you'll support me, he said casually. I'll spend your money, so of course I have to work harder. Then he looked at Anan outside and lowered his voice. It's not to satisfy your needs. Bai Shuili felt that he wasn't like him at all, and even more unlike him outside. She continued to pack up and ignored him. Yi Mulan didn't say much. He went to the kitchen and checked the fridge. It was still full. Then, he called someone to send some children's food. Later, he sat on the sofa with Anan in his arms and opened a top-notch home improvement store. He chose the decoration of the children's room, which was all original and could be lived in immediately. Tell me what you like. He held Anan in his arms, enjoying the feeling of a little girl in his arms. There was a faint smell on Anand's body, like the smell of a baby. It was different from her appearance, and his heart softened when he smelled it. Actually, he thought that he was originally very angry with Baishweli, but now he wasn't so angry anymore. He was angry because of this cute little thing. Anand looked at him. Can I do anything? Yi Mulan ruffled her short hair. Yes, both are fine, but Daddy prefers the pink one. Little girls will be happier living in it. But I like blue. Anand looked at him carefully and said dryly. Yi Mulan was startled, but he still smiled. Then it's fine if you like something else. Anand looked at it for a long time, but he did not get impatient. Finally, Anand pointed at a picture. I like this one. Chapter 36. I like you, Daddy. Anand wrapped her arms around Yi Mulan's neck. She accepted him as her father easily. Maybe she was only like this in front of him. She was cool in front of others. Yi Mulan glanced at her and agreed in the end. As long as she liked it. He picked up the phone and booked it. He asked someone to come over to pack it up in a while. The bedding was a complete set. Still clinging to him, Anand said softly, Daddy, you have to sleep with me. Yi Mulan was stunned. Otherwise I wouldn't dare. Anand said confidently. Yi Mulan sighed. Then why did you choose this one? Daddy's here. The little guy said without blushing or skipping a beat. He hugged him tightly with his little arms. Yi Mulan suddenly thought that if he wanted to sleep with Baishweli, Anand wanted him to accompany her, what should he do? Hence, Mr. Yi picked up the phone again and ordered a set of children's furniture. It was pink and blue, so Anand suddenly had 2 children's rooms. After hanging up the phone for less than an hour, the top-notch home improvement company came over. It took them more than 2 hours to finish the job and clean up the place. Anand was very happy. She stayed beside Yi Mulan and listened to the conversation between Yi Mulan and the rest of the people. She liked the last 2 rooms very much. When her father couldn't see, she secretly rolled around on the bed twice. Yi Mulan came over and happened to see it. The little girl immediately pretended not to care. He held back his laughter and walked over to sit by the bed, lying on the black bedsheet, and then made a face like a little devil. She said in a low voice, Daddy, can you sleep with me tonight? Yi Mulan thought for a while. Daddy will come back at 10 p.m., okay? Anand happily rolled around again, but after a while, she felt a little embarrassed. He looked at her and his heart softened. He felt that Anand was really a combination of him and Baishweli. He also lay over and hugged Anand. He put her in his arms and kissed her. However, Anand was like a little boy. After kissing her a few times, he felt that he was a little pervert. On the other hand, Anand was very clingy, rolling around in his arms. Baishweli packed her things and came over to have a look. She was speechless when she saw the room. Then she looked at how Anand was clinging to Yi Mulan. She was still a little shocked. Anand was not a clingy child. She was close to Gu Chaofeng, but she would never hug him like this. She looked at them, and Yi Mulan looked at her as well. It's getting late. Go and cook. He looked at the time. It was exactly 5 o'clock. After he was done, he could accompany Anand for dinner before going to the villa. Seeing that he was calm and composed, Baishweli snorted softly. Why am I the one cooking? I can do it. As long as you accompany me to make love at night, he said naturally with one hand on the pillow. Beside him, Anand looked at him, a few words written on her face. What is love? Baishweli was furious. She bit her lips. Yi Mulan, can you be more shameless? Can you not lead the child astray? Little Anand looked at her again. She was furious. I'll go and cook. With that, she walked to the kitchen. She felt a little wronged. He was treating her like a tool for childbirth, a nanny, and even used her to warm the bed. She would be stupid to stay by his side. Chapter 36-37. Yi Mulan nodded. Yes, she is angry. He paused and said, but she will be fine after a little coaxing. But he still coaxed her to sleep first. It had been a day and the 3-year-old had not slept at all. He turned his body sideways and placed her on his chest, coaxing her gently. He had coaxed Xiang Nam before, so he was very good with children. Anan curled up her little body and soon fell asleep peacefully. Her breath was fragrant and sweet. Yi Mulan slept with her for another 10 minutes before he got up and walked into the kitchen. The child's mother was still angry. In fact, she had been angry with him for almost 20 hours. He stood aside. Are you angry? It's obvious, isn't it? She cut the vegetables and glanced at him. You don't have to arrange a room for Anan. I want to bring her back to America next month. I'm only here to attend a book fair. Yi Mulan stared at her face. That's why you think it's okay to have sex with me once. I'm just your lover. As long as Gu Changfeng doesn't know about it, right? Don't talk too much. It has nothing to do with him. Bai Shueli lowered her head and cut the vegetables. I won't be with him. It had been so many years, and she definitely wouldn't be with him in the future. She wasn't sure in the past, but now she was sure. If she were with Gu Changfeng, she would really kill him and the entire Gu family. Bai Shueli was still able to see this clearly. Yi Mulan looked at her side profile, and his expression softened. It's good that you know. Bai Shueli's hands stopped cutting the vegetables. She lowered her eyes and did not make a sound or move. Then her tears fell one by one. It was unexpected. Yi Mulan was also stunned. He pursed his lips and asked, What's wrong? Bai Shueli did not speak. He was too despicable. He bullied her. He was very good to Anan, very good to Wen Yuan, very good to Yi Xiannan, but only to bully and coerce her. He called her by Xiao San, and she did not like it at all. She didn't have much ability, but she still had a little bit of backbone. Bai Shueli bit her lips, desperately trying not to cry out loud. Yi Mulan walked over. His tone wasn't very good. Why are you crying? Isn't it just a meal? She didn't say anything, so he added, You're already a mother. Why do you still cry so much? None of your business. She sniffed. Was I the one who caused the separation? Was it my fault alone? Yi Mulan, you're too unfair. She couldn't help but cry. She squatted down and covered her face. Yi Mulan reached out his hand to pull her up, but he couldn't because she refused. She cried shamelessly, and he couldn't do anything about it. He could only ask in a low voice, What do you want then? She was still crying, and he couldn't do anything about it. He didn't want to admit his mistake, and he didn't want to let her go so easily, so he simply carried her and pressed her into a chair. She still wanted to cry. His body pressed against hers, and his voice was low and husky. If you cry again, I'll do it with you right here. Do you want to sit on the chair or go to the wall? Bai Shueli, I'm telling you, it won't be very comfortable. She was so angry that she buried her face in his chest. Finally, she bit down hard on his chest. Chapter 36-38. Yi Mulan's heart ached, and the other part of his body ached even more. He wanted to kiss her. He tried to touch her lips. She was unwilling and turned her face away. Yi Mulan looked at her deeply and said in a low voice, You don't like it when I kiss you? She turned her face away, and there were still 2 drops of tears on her eyelashes. She looked very pitiful, but he still wanted to bully her. He pinched her chin and forced her to turn her head to look at him. Her eyes were watery, and she looked a little fragile. He sighed. She was already a woman in her early 30s, but she still looked like a little girl. She was about the same age as Wen Yuan. But Wen Yuan was already like a mother. He was mature and charming unlike her. She was already so old, but she was still as shallow as a little girl. But he liked little girls. His soft lips touched hers gently, and his other hand wiped away her tears. He said in a low voice, I like you. His heart was suddenly filled with tenderness and mischief. He pinched her chin and said in a low voice, Kiss me, Shueli. Her lips trembled and she pursed them tightly. She was unwilling to take the initiative to kiss him. He could not help but kiss her. He rubbed his lips against hers, but he was patient and did not kiss her deeply. Instead, he was seducing her. Their lips rubbed against each other and touched each other gently. She did not close her eyes, but looked at him with her eyes wide open. He was also looking at her, testing her little by little. He pressed his lips against hers and placed his large palm on her back, slowly seducing her. Bai Shueli's throat moved, and her lips were burning. She did not know what she should do. She did not want to respond to him, but she could not help but tilt her face up to meet his kiss. She did not know when her hands had wrapped around his neck. This kiss became wild. His hand pressed her back tightly and pulled her into his embrace. He rubbed her hard while she bit her lips. Other than not knowing what to do, she was also unable to restrain her emotions. Perhaps it was because she had suppressed it for too long. This kiss soon became hungry and thirsty, not only for him, but also for her. He only let go of her when he was satisfied. His unfathomable gaze became even deeper. He stared at her for a long time before he said in a hoarse voice, "Are you a little happier now?" She gasped softly, unable to utter a word. Yi Muelin's finger brushed past her slightly swollen red lips. It was a very suggestive gesture. He then smiled. "Let me cook." As he spoke, he walked to the counter. Bai Shueli's legs were still weak, and she looked at him in disbelief. His movements were swift, and he seemed to know what she was thinking. He said lightly, "Sometimes when I stay here I cook for myself." He paused. What he didn't tell her was that he had always thought that one day she would come back, and they would have a child of their own. He would take care of both mother and child, but he didn't expect that the child would already be there. Well, he did not have to spend time to make another one. Originally, he wanted a boy, but now that he was almost 40, there was no need. He had to spend time and energy. It was not convenient. As he cut the vegetables, his expression was especially gentle. Bai Shueli looked at him and said in a small voice, "Don't think that I'm willing to be your mistress just because you cooked a meal for me." His hand paused for a moment, and his voice was very soft. "If I cook for you every day and make love every day, would you be willing? I mean sleeping together every night." Chapter 36-39. He had made it clear, but that pig brain didn't understand. Bai Shueli leaned against the chair and said softly, "I don't want to." There was a hint of anger in her tone, and there was also a hint of arrogance in it. Yi Muelin glanced at her and didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She was just a pig brain. He continued to cook. He made 3 dishes and a soup, which tasted good and was suitable for children. After he was done, he went back to his room to take a shower and change his clothes. Then he went to Bai Ainan's bedroom to wake her up for dinner. Anan was sleeping soundly. Yi Muelin sat by the bed and wanted to wake her up, but thinking of her young age, she hadn't slept well for a day and a night, so he dismissed the idea. He looked at his watch. It was already 6:30, so he took a coat and walked out. As he put it on, he said, "I'm going back to the villa. She's still sleeping. Wake her up for dinner later." Bai Shueli sat on the sofa and watched him put on his coat and take his car keys. No, he should call her home. She smiled reluctantly and didn't say anything, but the expression on her face revealed her true feelings. She couldn't hide them at all. Yi Muelin looked at her quietly. After a long while, he smiled faintly and left without saying anything. When the door closed, she hugged her legs and bit her lip. When Yi Muelin drove back to the villa, it was half an hour before 8. Xiangnan was playing on the sofa, bouncing up and down. He opened his arms when he saw Yi Muelin. "Uncle." Yi Muelin walked over and picked him up. "Did Xiangnan do well today?" Wen Yuan smiled. "Very well." And Xiangnan's English was very good too. He was praised. Xiangnan revealed a very proud expression. Yi Muelin pinched his little face. "Good. Our Xiangnan is really great." He took out a toy from behind. "Uncle gave it to me." Xiangnan was very happy and played with it in his hands. Yi Muelin chatted with Wen Yuan about going abroad. He was a little surprised when he found out that Wen Yuan would be leaving in a week. "Isn't it a little too rushed?" Wen Yuan shook his head. "It's because the school there invited me to study there. I thought about it carefully and decided that it's fine to go there earlier." Yi Muelin nodded and smiled. "It's good that you've decided." Wen Yuan looked at him. "You didn't come back last night because, well, Shirley's back," he said shortly. Wen Yuan was still a little surprised. After a while, he hesitated and said, "Should we make our divorce public? I'm afraid she'll misunderstand." "No need. You can go to the United States." Yi Muelin sighed. "Wen Yuan, take good care of Xiangnan. No matter what happens, I will take care of him." He was a little worried about Wen Yuan. With Mu Bai's current personality, and the fact that he had lost his memories, he might be able to accept Xiangnan. But he would reject or even hate Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan nodded. I know. In her heart, she was actually very grateful to Yi Mulin. In the past, she had always thought that he was a cold-blooded man. However, after spending time with him, she realized that he was not. She actually guessed that the reason why he was so soft was probably because of Bai Xueli's influence. In the past, Yi Mulin was not so kind. He was a very cruel and merciless person. Chapter 3640. Yi Mulin ate dumplings at the villa, and accompanied Xiangnan for a while before preparing to leave. When he left, he hugged Xiangnan, and was about to leave when he suddenly turned to look at Xiangnan. Then he said to Wen Yuan, "Bring Xiangnan's jacket down. He has a fever. I'll take him to the hospital." Wen Yuan was also a little surprised. She reached out and touched Xiangnan's forehead gently. It was indeed a fever. She hurried upstairs and came down after a while to put the jacket on Xiangnan. Yi Mulin carried the child and walked towards his car. Wen Yuan opened the car door and got in first to take Xiangnan. Xiangnan's fever was quite bad, so they didn't think too much and went straight to the hospital. The doctor said it was acute pneumonia, probably because of the air in B City these few days. The doctor then looked at Yi Mulin and thought to himself, the leader's child still needs to be inhaled. Xiangnan was frightened. He lay quietly and said in a small voice, "Uncle, I'm scared." Yi Mulin moved his head over and gently pressed it against Xiangnan's. "Don't be afraid, Xiangnan. He'll be fine as long as he takes the injection and medicine." When Yuan came back from talking to the doctor outside, and his expression relaxed a little. With Yi Mulin's identity, Xiangnan naturally received the best treatment and care. She came in and reached out to touch Xiangnan's head. She lowered her voice and said to Yi Mulin, "You go back first. I'll be fine here." Yi Mulin said without thinking, "I'll stay and take care of him. I'll leave tomorrow morning." When Yuan disagreed, "Xueli just came back. And Anan, right? Don't let her misunderstand." Yi Mulin smiled. It's okay to let her misunderstand. With that, he didn't say anything else. He just focused on feeding Xiangnan water. Xiangnan looked at him and said softly, "Isn't an uncle's child?" "Yes." Yi Mulin reached out and touched his little head. His voice was low and hoarse. "Xiangnan needs to get better soon. Otherwise, Anan is stronger and more handsome than you." Xiangnan smiled. It was a delicate smile with a kind of weak beauty. Yi Mulin thought of his daughter and sighed in his heart. She really looked like a boy. He stayed for the whole night and remembered that he and Wen Yuan also had a recurring fever at night. Neither he nor Wen Yuan slept well. Although they weren't husband and wife, they had raised their child together, so he couldn't leave Wen Yuan alone. At 10 o'clock in the evening, he called Bai Xueli and told her that he wouldn't be coming back and asked her to tell Anan. He didn't explain anything else. Bai Xueli didn't ask him anything either. The two of them stared at each other in silence for a while before she said somewhat awkwardly, "I'll hang up then." After hanging up, Yi Mulin smoked a cigarette in the corridor before returning to the ward. Xiangnan slept, and he asked Wen Yuan to sleep as well. The two of them took turns to take care of the child. Fortunately, Xiangnan's fever went down by dawn. Yi Mulin heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he casually took a shower and gave some instructions to Wen Yuan. Then, he called the servants at home and asked them to prepare breakfast for Xiangnan. He also called the doctors at the hospital. Only then did he drive out of the hospital. He returned to the apartment. Because it was 7 in the morning, it was very quiet inside. He first went to the pink and blue room. He was sure that Anan would sleep in it. Chapter 3641. Children were easily forgetful. The little girl, who had been very angry last night, had long forgotten about it. She slept soundly like a little angel. Yi Mulin sat down and gently touched her little face with his fingers. It was soft and tender. He smiled and his heart softened. He sat for a while and returned to the master bedroom. The mother was still asleep. She slept in the same position as Anan, lying on her side and holding a pillow in her hands. She looked indescribably childish. Yi Mulan bent down and pinched her face. Get up. Bai Shueli was woken up by him. She opened her eyes, which were a little bloodshot. He was startled and his voice was hoarse. You slept late last night? She closed her eyes again and hugged the pillow. I translated late. Why are you here so early? His voice was very soft. Xiangnan was hospitalized. His fever only subsided this morning. Bai Shueli's eyes opened a slit. Shouldn't you stay in the hospital to take care of him? You still have to work. Yi Mulan rolled his eyes at her, as if what she said was stupid. She ignored him, and hugged the pillow to sleep again. Yi Mulan thought of something. It should be time for Anan to go to work. I'll ask Secretary Li to arrange a room, and see which one is suitable. Bai Shueli's voice was vague. No need. He glanced at her, and then went to the changing room to pick out some clothes. He changed by the bed without avoiding her. He said mildly as he held the clothes. Why not? Anan is about the same age as Xiangnan. Bai Shueli buried her face in the pillow, and then opened her eyes to talk to him. But when she opened her eyes, she saw that he was changing, and she could see his six-pack. She bit her lip, and felt a little incredulous. He was always in the office, socializing and reading endless documents. Where did he train his muscles? Yi Mulan stared at her, and smiled faintly. Didn't you say that you don't have any physical needs? Why are you looking at me for so long? Bai Shueli snorted softly. I've seen too many foreign movies. Yours is really nothing. Yi Mulan frowned, and then put down his clothes and walked towards her. Bai Shueli immediately sat up, hugged the quilt tightly and screamed softly. What are you doing? He pinned her down, and stared at her with an unfathomable gaze. His voice was low and husky. Haven't you seen it many times? What are you afraid of? As he said that, he pulled her hand over to feel his six-pack abs. It turned out that Bai Shueli had thought too much before. She had thought that he was going to be a hooligan. Although it was still considered a hooligan now, it was much better. However, the truth proved that she was thinking too much. It would be strange if he didn't act like a hooligan. Her hand was pressed down by him. She could feel his touch as she whispered, Yi Mulan, you bastard. Let go of me. He pressed her down and pressed his body against hers. How is it? She was stunned. What do you mean? He paused for a moment, then leaned close to her ear and whispered breathlessly, Don't you suspect me am Wen Yuan? Bai Shueli was stunned again, and then blurted out, Isn't it normal for you to have something going on with her? They had been husband and wife for so long. She did not dare to think that they were still innocent. After she said that, his face darkened and he stared at her for a long time. Bai Shueli, you're really good. She couldn't understand why he was so angry, so she turned her face away. Let go. Chapter 36:42. Bai Shueli lay back down, buried her face in the pillow, and looked at him. Can you handle it? Yi Mulan didn't quite understand what she meant. What did she mean by can I handle it? Bai Shueli looked at him. I mean, can you handle two families? He chuckled lightly, got up, and continued to put on his clothes. Bai Shueli, you can try. He paused for a moment. Wen Yuan and Xiangnan are going abroad soon. We won't bump into each other. The meaning behind his words was too hateful. Bai Shueli glared at him. Yi Mulan chuckled lightly, put on his trousers and belt. Because he was going to work, he wore a white shirt and a dark coat. After putting it on, he sat down beside her and became serious. What did you say to Anan last night? About Wen Yuan and Xiangnan? She also sat up, not realizing that she was only wearing a thin silk pajamas. She hugged herself and asked softly, Yi Mulan, what do you want me to say to her? Yi Mulan stared at her eyes for a long time before he whispered, Bai Shueli, what do you want? She smiled and said helplessly, If I said that I don't want to be with you again, would you believe me? Then she said to herself, Yi Mulan, I'm used to being alone, and Anan is used to not having a father. He looked down at her, his voice a little hoarse. Bai Shueli, do you want Anan to be without a father for the rest of her life? She's very independent. She tried to reason with him. Yi Mulan smiled coldly. But she knows that I'm her father now. His fingers gently stroked her little face. You want me to divorce and marry you, huh? Actually, it didn't matter. As long as she wanted it, he could do it. He didn't need her to say it. He had already divorced her. How could he bear to let her suffer? But she really dared to think so badly of him. She thought that he wanted to have the best of both worlds. Did she think that all these years, he just casually got together with Wen Yuan because of his physical needs? Wen Yuan's child was Mubai's. Was he so immoral in her heart? He reached out and pinched her chin. He wanted to crush it, but he held back. Bai Shuili didn't fall for his trick. She said with a cold face, Yi Mulan, what's wrong with you? I didn't ask you to divorce me and marry me. He looked at her for a long time and suddenly said, You're still the same as before, pig brain. She got even angrier and argued with him. He impatiently leaned over and kissed her, his voice hoarse. If you dare to say another word, I'll make you unable to get off the bed. Bai Shuili was stunned for a moment. How could he be like this? She glared at him and bit her lip. Her face seemed to be on fire. He smiled and bit her lips. When a man quarreled with a woman, he could act like a hooligan if he couldn't win an argument. He could even get physical. In short, the woman would always be the one at a disadvantage in the end. Bai Shuili didn't dare to continue arguing with him. She curled up at the head of the bed and suddenly remembered something. Where's little Xiaobai? It's been made into tortoise soup. Yi Mulan caressed her red lips, his voice hoarse. If it weren't for the fact that he had to go to work, he wouldn't have let her go. Although they had done it after they reunited, he had been single for almost a year. How could one night be enough? You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.